FCC TV will be ready at 7:30, and live stream will be as well, Mayor.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, I've got 7:30. Should we begin? Let's call our meeting to order and get started. Someone may not have their computer muted. I might just ask if all of those who are not speaking, please mute your computer so that we don't have an echo. Anyway, it's 7:30. Welcome to the Monday, April 4th, 2022 work session of the Falls Church City Council. I'm going to ask the clerk now to read the notice that is required. Madam Clerk?
And I'm going to do that for you this evening, Mayor, since it's a work session.
Okay.
And I can also do the roll call for you. So, the meeting for which this agenda has been posted will be held pursuant to and in compliance with the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, Section 2.2-3708.2, as well as state and local legislation adopted to allow for continued government operations during COVID-19 declared emergency. All participating members of City Council and other boards will be present at this meeting through electronic means, and members of the public can view the meeting at www.fallschurchva.com/council meetings and on FCC TV, Cox Channel 11, RCN 2, and Verizon 35. City Council work sessions are conducted to allow council members to discuss upcoming legislation and policy issues. The public is not generally invited to speak. Public comment, however, may be sent to cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov, and all comments are provided in full to the members of City Council and will be summarized at the next meeting. For roll call, Ms. Connolly?
Here.
Mr. Duncan?
Here.
Ms. Hardy?
Here.
Ms. Leon?
Here.
Ms. Sean Siscott?
Here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
And Mayor Tarter.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we do have a busy agenda tonight, starting with budget and a lot of sub-items under the budget, as you can see on the screen. But we do also have a number of other items that can very well go for a pretty good while. So I would just ask everyone's patience, and let's try to keep disciplined and on schedule as best we can. And let's just get right to it. So Mr. Shields, we got a couple budget items. Would you like to introduce those?
Well, thank you, Mayor. And what we plan to do is have Cindy walk us through an overview of the capital improvements program, and then we will go through the documents themselves that are slated for the agenda on Monday night, and those include the budget ordinance, but also the tax ordinances, the stormwater fee ordinance and the sanitary sewer ordinance, and the commercial and industrial overlay tax proposal. So we do want to have a discussion of those as well, but let me first turn it over to Cindy for a walkthrough of the CIP and discussion and council feedback on the CIP. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and Mr. Shields. I'm looking forward to a good discussion on the CIP. I am joined by many of our CIP team members that will be available to assist with Q&A as we go through this work session. Of course, doing the CIP, it does take a village, does during the development of the process, and of course throughout the implementation, and many departments are actively involved. Just want to highlight a few things in the staff report, and then I'm going to shift over to a PowerPoint. And then also in the council packet, there's additional information that was available as background information as well. And just prior to this evening's meeting, you were sent an email with the link to everything on the website for the CIP, as well as the CIP video, which is the same page as the departmental budget video link, but we just wanted to make sure it was clear that everything was in that one place. So as Mr. Shields indicated tonight, this will be an opportunity to do sort of a deeper dive into the CIP and anticipate a lot of dialogue, questions, and input. And if there's any questions we can't answer this evening, we'll certainly circle back with you. I do want to note that the CIP that's before you has been adopted by the Planning Commission on March 16th, and that is what folded into the recommendation by the city manager. There were 2 changes in the CIP that the city manager was able to do after the Planning Commission actions. So I wanted to call out the additional $100,000 per year in pay-go starting in FY23 for each year. That complements some money we had in the out years with the NVTA 30% funds. And also we'll discuss further through the presentation, but an additional $200,000 local money for important replacement and reinvestment of things like equipment and vehicles. The Planning Commission did endorse also in their motion, which is included in the staff report in full for you at line 22, some key items in addition to projects. I just wanted to highlight that. In future CIPs, they ask that the council and the community really look at preserving and expanding affordable housing, really looking at producing and installing renewable energy facilities, assess and implement protected bike lanes, remove obstacles in sidewalks such as utility poles, and also look at green infrastructure as a way to control flooding and have it as part of a climate resilience plan. So I wanted to highlight just those few things from the Planning Commission. There's a lot of other details in the staff report, but this evening we wanted to spend the majority of the time focusing on the projects. So in the presentation that I'll go through, we're really going to be talking about the capital improvements program, which really does transformative investments into the community. So as Mr. Shields presented the budget, talked about trying to make sure we could do the core service deliveries, but also those transformative focus, and those are, a lot of them are in the CIP, of course. So we'll highlight some of our active projects, recents, really focus on the projects, but also sort of what's the staffing and the financial components tied to the CIP. We have a slide to speak to the transportation, commercial, industrial tax that Mr. Shields mentioned during his budget presentation, as well as flagging for the community the resources that are available on the city's website. So in terms of what is in the CIP, we currently are working 28 current projects, because of course this is an ongoing process. We have the money that was approved last year and prior years, as well as the ones we're proposing before you in this CIP. And over the next 6 years, there's actually 65 additional projects that would be those transformative investments in the community. As a quick snapshot, in FY23, there's $20 million proposed in the CIP. That's general fund, transportation, stormwater, and sanitary sewer. And over the 6 years, you can see $116 million. A lot of good active projects are underway, and we give you that update in the quarterly snapshot. And that January 22nd snapshot, the most current, is posted with your packet this evening. A lot of great accomplishments as we continue to deliver projects on time and under budget and meeting community needs through the COVID period. And now, jumping right into projects, I've organized the next few slides by the functional categories as they're posted in the CIP. Everything is on the CIP with the link that you received this afternoon via email, and it will also be in the slide presentation at the end. And for each of those, you'll see that I have flagged a tab notation here on this slide. So if you were going to tab 4 or 5 on the website, you will get the more detailed information for these projects that we've summarized here. You'll see the same for Rex and Park or utilities, for example. So under public safety and information technology, these are really our core infrastructures. So there is funding in the CIP for Fire Station 6, public safety radios, facility security, and core infrastructure reinvestment on the IT front. A few highlights that I'll make for each of these projects, and of course, myself and staff will be glad to answer any additional questions on a deeper dive. The Fire Station 6 continues the annual allocation per our interjurisdictional agreement, but I did want to flag for FY23, there's $450,000 in 1 year, Normally it's $150,000 per year, so we're front-loading it and then have some gaps of funding to average out, as it were, that $150,000. This is to cover the cost of the bay door replacement, the 10 doors at the fire station. In FY21, there was funding and $500,000 for these doors, and during the COVID period, the cost of the doors have actually doubled. And we had delayed issuing debt when we went into COVID because of the revenue loss. So this would be the money to be able to do all the doors at the same time for efficiency of moving our firefighters in and out and the equipment, the apparatus. The public facility security, I just want to highlight that's the digital electronic control access to all the doors and security. We currently have that at the library and city hall, so this CIP would allow us to do community center, property yard, Gage House, Roar House, the rest of our facilities. And on the IT side, the infrastructure reinvestment, this is a CIP project that we started last year to have regular funding. It ranges between $150,000 to $200,000 per year to reinvest into important things like firewalls, switches, intrusion detection devices, things related to cybersecurity. General facilities, certainly a very important part of the CIP. This is to allow us to keep reinvesting in the facilities while we've done the major big projects recently, as you know, with City Hall, the high school, and the library. We need to continually reinvest and hopefully get on a more staggered term so the big projects don't come due all at once. So you'll see continued public facilities reinvestment for general government. And I wanted to flag for FY23, there's additional money beyond our normal annual allocation for the property yard. This is for some significant safety issues, as Mr. Shields mentioned during his presentation, for the fleet lift and the doors for the maintenance bay, as well as an assessment for the facility needs long term. Using ARPA money, we do have community HVAC reinvestment. This is an overhaul and replacement of the core system that's over the gym, the administrative areas, for example, which will improve air quality, replace end-of-life equipment that is fortunately just hanging in on all our safety crosswalks, as well as, because we have to take the whole ceiling down to do this, we'll be able to do some energy efficiency with LED lighting and a ceiling that's easier to maintain. Continue to partner with the schools on reinvesting in the school facilities, so they also have a facility reinvestment project so that we do regular reinvestment each year. And you can see the total amount over the 10-year period. For FY23, the focus is on the HVAC at the middle school and flooring, and there is a $1 million grant that the schools submitted through the state. And pending the state budget, we are optimistic for that grant. They also have an Oak Street Elementary School specific project in the CIP. This would span time over 23 to 27 from design to construction, but there is a grant also pending in FY23 for this school, which would allow for upfront next year an accessible entrance, as this school does not have it. It's the only school without an ADA accessible entrance, and as well as a standalone secure lobby. So very important areas around the schools for the other facilities. And also new this year, and very important as well, is a new CIP project paid with PAYGO at $200,000 a year for capital replacement and reinvestment. And this is looking at that regular focus that we've needed around IT equipment, vehicles, fleet, fields, courts, that type of thing, to regularly have a resource to fund those items. On the recreation and parks front, 3 areas to focus on: continuing the master plan implementation. Over 10 years, it's a $3 million amount. It's $150,000 in debt on an annual basis, and they do have one proffer that would be coming through that would be appropriated as well in the CIP. Fellows Property, that community engagement is undergoing, as you are aware from the recent community meetings and work with the advisory board, and then it'll proceed to design. $200,000 is already appropriated for that part of the project. This CIP would propose $500,000 in FY24 for the construction. Or the implementation of what comes out of the plan. And I wanted to note, as Mr. Shields had indicated during the budget, we're seeing escalation of costs, and so we've accounted for that in several areas of CIP projects. This is one where the estimate went from $400,000 to $500,000. Synthetic turf is another piece that Rex and Park Director and Advisory Board has been identifying as a need, since they have a certain life cycle that we need to start staggering in funding, so every 3 years we're ready to replace one of the fields that comes up. And that's a staggered funding need. Over the 10-year period, it would be $1.7 million. This is one of the items that would fit into that capital replacement investment funding project that I mentioned under facilities. We placed it in that category because it helps with a lot of facility things, but it could be broader and covered this type of project as well. Transportation. This, as we know, is a big chunk of the CIP, and I've actually had to do 3 slides because I couldn't get it all into one slide since it's such a big component of our reinvestment in the community. For FY23, there's $6.5 million programmed. Pleased to note that $5.2 million of that is state and federal grants. And I also just wanted to reiterate that all the CIP is a multi-year funding cycle, but that's really prevalent in transportation because oftentimes our funding from the state gets allocated over 3 to 4 years. And of course, these are big, complex projects, and so, or the majority of them are, so it really takes design, engineering, construction over multi-fiscal years. I wanted to flag that because the key document in action that's before Council is the FY23 to 28 CIP with that next 4-year, 29 to 32 look ahead. But sometimes when we're just presenting the current CIP, it's easy to forget that we've already approved significant reinvestment in the community last year, for example. So for an FY22, just for transportation, there was $4.5 million appropriated, and this CIP for FY23 brings forward another $6.5. If you look at the full 6-year cycle of transportation CIP projects, that's $81 million, $67 million of which is grant dollars. And then looking at the long view, that's that 29 to 32 fiscal years, we actually have about $89 million of additional CIP projects proposed for transportation. The majority of those are unfunded because they're consistent with the comp plan, the area plans, and we need to research for grants. But when you go researching for grants, they want to make sure it's in the CIP. So we flag them as needs for implementation, and you can see the areas that we're focusing on, and that'll allow us to plan in the out years grant, staffing, and implementation. And because transportation is a very complex arena, I did want to flag for the council and the community that we do have a more detailed delivery schedule that talks about all those phases of design, engineering, and construction, and how the money in those projects flow over fiscal years. That's in tab 8 of the CIP that's posted on the website. It is also an attachment to your staff report this evening that is posted to Granicus that the public can access. And a lot of the summary money that I'm speaking to on this slide, you'll find under tab 3. That's also where you'll find the money details for general government, schools, transportation, as I'm noting now, as well as the utilities. So very useful documents with a lot more details posted to the website. As Mr. Shields mentioned Monday, the 28th, when he presented the proposed budget, we have quite a few projects in various stages already in implementation. So I wanted to highlight those again Because they're multi-year, you also see them in this CIP, but a lot of this funding is also already appropriated. So the money that's here is the total project costs. So very exciting that we have under design the Park Avenue Great Street that will really transform Park Avenue from the State Theater to the library with undergrounding of utilities, widening sidewalks, a central gathering place around the City Hall, and improved intersections of pedestrian walkability. That's the same core concept with the Shreve Road, which is this one and Park Avenue are both NVTA grants that would really improve the walkability, access, and intersections to the Westfall's redevelopment in our schools. South Oak Street Bridge is one that we've been talking about for a while. It is under design, almost done, and we will be going to construction over the late summer. And we will be coordinating with the schools, of course, since we're near the elementary school. This will improve the structure over the creek, the road foundation of the bridge, but most importantly, sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, and additional crosswalks. So really will connect a lot of our work that we're doing with South Oak, South Lee neighborhood traffic calming project with the Greenway Downs neighborhood traffic calming projects, and really make for a comprehensive, holistic approach to that part of the city. Greening of Lincoln, and I want to note we also have stormwater tied to that, so this is just the transportation funding. And within this CIP and under design is additional sidewalks and bus shelters and NTC. As I noted at the beginning, this CIP includes $100,000 local money for NTC going every year, so it's embedded as an ongoing commitment. But we also have the ARPA money that Council has already allocated that will assist with sidewalks and bus shelters. And we have an opportunity with a just announced federal grant application process through Congressman Beyer and the community request to pursue additional multimodal pedestrian sidewalk resources. Continuing on the transportation front for another slide, do want to flag the contract awards that we're proceeding with, and you can see this is a fair amount of intersection work, which certainly improves the traffic movement, but most importantly, the pedestrian, the crosswalks, the safety, and really upgrades a lot of our aging infrastructure. Very excited that those are proceeding, once again, predominantly grant funded. And of course, we do have under construction now the South Maple and South Washington, which just started under construction. Westfalls and that whole intermodal area where around our redevelopment area where we're undergrounding, improving sidewalks and intersection work. And then South Washington Street, which hopefully with some of our delayed polls due to supply, that'll get done late spring, but it is progressing really nicely. So moving into our utilities for a few moments, I do want to highlight Sanitary Sewer. This is tab 10. That's our utilities tab in the posted CIP. This is pretty consistent with projects that we've been doing over the years because they're an ongoing commitment. In terms of the treatment plant, we pay our pro rata share of the investment in those treatment plants, and so we have our annual debt responsibility. So you'll see that for the treatment plant with Alexandria Wastewater, as well as Arlington. Now the capacity is also with Alexandria. We do have $6 million that's in the CIP. $2 million of that would be debt, but the majority of that is covered with availability fees. That process, that review, and that quotes are still under progress, so they will be refined, but this is what staff has proposed for the CIP that's before you. And then an important one, of course, remains our sewer rehabilitation, taking care of those old pipes, the relining, expanding capacity, and so forth. And that over a 10-year period is $5.8 2.2 million, and it's basically about 750,000 a year. You'll see for this CIP, we're picking up funding pay-go in FY26, but we do have current money that was delayed in deployment because of COVID. A lot of it was contracting, but also staff capacity when we had to reprioritize to respond to COVID. On the stormwater front, the community has had some great dialogue on this, as we know, and the task force and now the new Utilities Commission will be a great resource to continue that. I did want to flag before getting into the stormwater flooding remediation, the 4 Mile Run project is one that continues to be in the CIP in the out years to allow for us to go for grants. But this is a really important one that's consistent with area plans, and we've had some student research projects and concept designs. So that'll be something we'll look forward to in the out years. But in the near term, we're working on the stormwater flooding remediation, the big 6+, as we've often referred to them. Do want to flag that for FY22, Council's already appropriated $7.4 million in ARPA funding, and I labeled that local ARPA funding. That's the city's allocation because we do have a state pending ARPA grant. So for FY23, it proposes $5.1 million in additional funding for stormwater, and we just received, and as we noticed at a previous council meeting, $400,000 from a community request appropriations. This is the one that Congressman Byer put in on the city's behalf. It's the same funding process in which we got the schools got the EV school buses, but for the general government side, it was $400,000 for stormwater. We do have pending before the General Assembly $4 million in state ARPA money that Senator Saslaw submitted on behalf of the council's request, and so optimistic that that will prevail once we hear about the state budget. And we also have a state STAG grant pending. So a lot of stormwater funding is now being with grant funded, which, as Mr. Shields noted, reduces the pressure on the stormwater utility rate because we don't have to issue as much debt for capital. We do need to take care of the operating side. Now, where are we in terms of some of the projects? I wanted to be able to highlight that. So we have quite a few projects that are in planning and design, and then the planning's complete, our planning started, and then we can proceed into construction, as you can see. So these are outlining the big 6, as well as talking about the greening of Lincoln, and that's $2 million here. And under transportation, I noted the $2.5 million for the Lincoln greening project. That's both transportation and stormwater. And then the CIP also is looking towards the out years for additional funding from FY26 and on, because a lot of the projects on this slide are speaking to the work that's happening between starting last year in FY22 through 24 and 25. And the completion dates are listed there for you, but we want to make sure that we're still continuing to look ahead and addressing additional projects that are known from the task force work, the original watershed plan, as well as staff assessment. And so you can see here an ongoing commitment to green infrastructure and then some additional projects to help with flooding remediation. All of these, again, sanitary sewer and stormwater are under tab 11. So we talked a lot about the what, a little bit about the how, and then we'll open up for questions. In the CIP, we did continue for the second year the equity lens and have added the environmental impact lens that was directed and requested by the Planning Commission. Both of these are the same lenses that we used as part of Council's legislative program as well. Staffing. We have a lot of projects, as I noted, and a lot of grant dollars and funding committed to these, but we got to be able to execute and deploy. So I wanted to provide a synopsis of where we are on staffing. So under the existing column, you can see that we've organized it by project management, procurement, contracts, and grants. We definitely have to have the staff that can help oversee the concept, the design, the engineering, and then execution, implementation, and construction. But we also need to have procurement, contracts, and grants. And we've mentioned that previously, but that's an important piece, especially now that we're doing significantly much more with federal funding, and that requires a different level of procurement, contract, and reporting. And in terms of the ARPA, it significantly escalated the reporting that we'll be doing to the U.S. Treasury. In fact, our next report for anything we've expended to date, whether it's capital or operating ARPA, is due April 30th. On the project management side, we have 5.5 FTEs allocated currently for project management. About 70% of those staff salaries can be charged to the CIP, so the project bears the weight of those staff costs. We never reach 100% simply because you've got staff meetings, leave, trainings that are not project eligible. We do have 3 FTEs from Public Works targeted towards procurement, contracts, and grant management. I do want to note that those staff are also doing all of the contracts for operating as well, so leaf pickup, snow removal, regular maintenance paving. So about 25% of each of those FTEs are allocated to the CIP. Planning also has a 0.2 FTEs contributing to the grant management side of things, and finance has 1 purchasing manager that serves the general government and some of the school bigs procurement processes, but of course provides significant support for capital projects. So that's existing. Where I've labeled new, it's new because it's now part of the FY22 current budget, and we're currently in the recruitment process for hiring and bringing those people on. So I wanted to highlight a little more those new positions. So Public Works will have an additional project manager coming on board, as well as support for contract and procurement because of all the projects we've been describing. And Council has also approved a 0.5 FTE using ARPA money to help with grant compliance and procurement related to the ARPA funds. So the existing and the new positions were the ones that were targeted when we built this current CIP to staff and deliver per the schedules that I've summarized this evening. It's robust and it works, but it doesn't have a lot of stretch and give. So there's not currently enough give to expedite a zillion projects, for example, or bring a brand new project in. We can bring in grant dollars that support an existing project and maybe free up local, but we are built to deliver as proposed. It's a robust, a lot of good work, and in reality, we couldn't do them all at the same time, so you need to stagger and have them in different stages. But I do want to acknowledge that we've aligned staff to these resources. You will see in the unmet needs part of the budget that the city manager proposed additional needs, and I've itemized a few here. Under Public Works, it would be a construction inspector and a transportation engineer. These would help quite a bit on the operating side, but on the construction inspector, for example, if they were out inspecting commercial, private construction as well as CIP, then the project manager wouldn't have to be out in the field inspecting. They could be working on the next project's design or some change orders or different parts of the administration. So those 2 positions are noted in the proposed budget as additional needs. Similarly, for Public Works, there's a Stormwater Grants Manager position flagged, and then for Finance, it would be an Assistant Procurement staff. Continuing a little bit more on the how, we've talked about the equity, environmental, and staffing. This is the funding side of the CIP with some summary looks at it. This is all of the CIP projects, general fund, transportation, and utilities displayed in a pie chart. And again, transportation remains the largest share of that pie at 67%. But there is strong commitment in all areas, as you can see. This summary chart is in the manager's message in your proposed budget, and it just at a quick glance gives you the functional areas I described and the dollar amounts associated with them for the FY23 as well as the full 6-year look. Now, this chart is hard on the screen. I know. I just wanted to flag for you because this is one of the tab 3 charts that you can look at summary level where we're funding with grants, debt, pay-as-you-go, and if there's out years where we're looking or small gaps of unfunded is green. So this is a good resource to look at the funding sources, and then the other documents will give you project specifics and or schedule details. The CIP needs to be compliant with the Council's adopted financial policies, and it is in terms of fund balance. You can see here, and this is a similar charts that you saw when the budget was presented, where the available fund balance is and where the 20% of expenditure line is at red, and then down here is the 17. So the CIP is compliant with fund balance as well as debt service as a percentage of expenditures. This is the same chart that shows up in the full budget presentation as well, showing existing debt in blue, new as proposed in the CIP that's before you for additional debt, and then what the policy targets and limits are. Now, as Mr. Shields mentioned during the budget presentation on the 28th, there is a proposal to implement the commercial and industrial tax, the CNI. And so I wanted to spend a little bit time highlighting that and providing some additional details. So currently, the city does have the existing utilization of CNI equivalent, the CNIE. That's been in place since 2013 with the General Assembly legislation that allows us to do that for transportation. Localities have the choice to do 100% CNI, 100% CNIE, or a hybrid. This proposal in this budget would be a bit of a hybrid. It would reduce the CNIE to 7.5 cents, and this is based on the commercial assessed value minus apartments because they wanted to exclude affordable housing when the legislation was first adopted by the General Assembly. So instead of 12.5 cents, the proposed budget would retain 7.5 cents. It's assessed on the commercial real estate tax base, but it's applied to everyone because it's in the general tax base. The difference for FY23 would be to have 5 cents targeted in the CNI, and that is applied to commercial only. It generates $403,000 per year. Whether it's CNI or CNIE, it is for transportation only. CNI has a narrower definition for expansion. So in the proposed budget, we are looking to use it for WMATA capital, sidewalk capital, for example. And I do want to note for the public and have it in the record that the why we do a CIP is to execute Council's vision, the comprehensive plan, and so I put those in to document the source of which we build all of the capital project. For some where information, I did want to highlight for the community that we do have the interactive map on the website that shows all the capital improvement projects, and we update it 2 to 3 times a year with where we are on projects, so you can look at who's the project manager, general scope, dollar amount, and a high-level delivery. We also have the neighborhood traffic calming map, which is a more narrowed down into the smaller streets, and right now I'm circling greenways down, for example. So those are both on the website and community resources, as well as the website links that we've mentioned previously for the budget as a whole and the CIP in particular. And both of these links will get you to the new videos that have been produced for our budget, the departmental ones and the CIP one. And then for the public, how to reach me with questions. And with that, Mayor and Mr. Shields, I'll be glad to pause now and look forward to comments and questions.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for that very thorough presentation. As I'm sure is obvious to all, there's lots of capital work being done here in the city and lots planned for the future. And as you mentioned, we have been aggressive in seeking grants to ease the burden on our taxpayers and have been quite successful, as you've seen, with a number of projects going up throughout the city over the coming years and in the past years that are funded in part or in whole through grants. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions from anyone that we might have. And again, just a reminder, we're actually scheduled to begin our next item, the Westfall Church Senior Housing, at 8:15, which of course we won't do, but just be mindful if you can that we do have a few other items on tonight. But let's go ahead and open it up to questions and comments. Mr. Snyder? Dave?
Thank you very much, Cindy. So we have a lot of citizen interest in doing more faster on transportation, especially pedestrian and bike. We've all received emails from a citizen group. Have we explored other options to move more rapidly on these projects? For example, maybe cooperative contracting with surrounding jurisdictions, in addition to hiring additional people. I see as much as we're doing, and it's a lot, and partly my job is to get these grants and to work with you for projects that will support grant requests, and so thank you for a huge amount of work. But I get the sense that it's not enough. It's not enough, it's not fast enough. So what can we do to move more rapidly on bike ped issues in particular? That would be question number one. And then question number two, something not in here is, of course, the Route 7 BRT. And I did note that we got some communication from Senator Warner about really big projects are potential for, for funding under the infrastructure program. So let me just set that aside as a comment to be dealt with later with you as to how we could do a moonshot, if you will, on that potentially. But with regard to the CIP in front of us, have you looked at options to move more rapidly to get more bike and pedestrian sidewalks, all those things that our citizens really are constantly contacting us about? Is there a better, faster way to get the job done? Thank you.
Sure. Let me make a few comments on that, and certainly glad to have a separate follow-up on the Warner initiatives and working with NVTC on the bus rapid transit. For bike ped and the sort of that multimodal piece, I think we're in a much better position to move faster than we have been for a couple reasons. One, we have funding. It's hard to do sidewalks and those type of things without adequate money because we were just having small amounts and not enough to do more than the missing segments. So I think the ARPA money will help there. I think bringing on the staff that you saw on the staffing chart that will allow us to reduce the bottleneck at procurement and contracts will be very helpful, but we're just now executing that process, so I think you'll start seeing benefits from that soon. We are trying for the first time to use VDOT as a construction manager, and South Oak Street Bridge is the first one we're trying that on. I think it's really important for the city to stay in the driver's seat for concept design and make sure that it's built the way we want it, not a suburban VDOT road design. But they obviously are staffed up to do construction, and they've agreed to do it, and the administrative fee would be the same sort of thing we would be doing anyway. So we've gotten South Oak Street all the way through right-of-way design and everything, and we're now passing the baton to them. And while we'll stay involved in oversight with the PM, all that workload will come off of that PM, which is allowing another PM to be, that same PM to be assigned to another position. So I think that's something that if that works, another place where that would be probably beneficial is the Shreve Road, because that's the MVTA projects. That's 3/4 of it's in Fairfax County. It's our regional partnership, so it probably would make sense for VDOT to manage it. So that's another area. And I guess the fourth point I'll make is we have worked hard to do a lot of our procurement contracts so they have all the federal terms in them. Because what slows you down is when you get federal money for a project and you have to stop and do the federal procurement. So, for example, we just redid all of our task order contracting for stormwater and transportation engineering with all the federal terms in them up front. So that now when we start doing these projects like the sidewalk ARPA money, it already is federally procured to start on the design and engineering. So we literally just finished those and executing them, so we haven't seen the benefit of it, but I think we will. And just one note, you mentioned cooperative agreements under ARPA. We can't do a cooperative agreement, so that tool isn't available to us where we're using federal funds.
Thank you. And just to follow up, I know there's a lot of bike interest in protected bike lanes and particularly Park Avenue. So we can delve into those kind of details later. Thank you very much.
All right, Ms. Hardy. Letty?
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, my Microsoft Teams interface changed, so all the little buttons are different. Thank you, Cindy. I think like Dave and the other Dave said, I think the good news is there's lots of grant money being deployed on the CIP, especially on the stormwater front. So I think that is definitely good news for our residents and how we're trying to leverage the free money that's out there, and obviously being past the peak of the big CIP lift that we've done the past couple of years, now that we're back under kind of the debt to expenditure guidance. Couple of kind of macro questions and then some specific ones. On slide 21, where we talk about kind of that view of how much is going to be debt funded versus grant funded versus kind of capital reserve. I assume that under the pay-as-you-go capital reserve, that includes both cash as well as voluntary concessions. Is that correct?
Yes, this CIP only has the voluntary concession right now for Rexham Park.
Got it. I guess that would be a helpful view going forward, is to think about those sources of money in those four buckets, right? So what's being debt funded, what's we're paying for out of operating as kind of pay-go, what's VC funded, and what's grant funded. I think that would be a useful view, because especially as we talk about continuing economic development, why VCs are an important source of that funding of our CIP.
We certainly could do that. Just for the facts, the VC in this 6-year CIP is $193,000 for Rexham Park in FY24. So not a significant amount, but certainly your point to break it out when we start seeing the VCs kick in.
Great. So my corollary question then is, do we have any VC money outstanding that is not yet allocated? So specifically from Founders Row, and then Broad and Washington, which obviously is just underway, and then now Founders Row 2, since we've given it entitlements. Do we have that number? And we don't have to have it now, but I think it's useful to kind of think about in the out years what outside money we might expect from those projects.
We can note that for a follow-up.
Thank you. And then likewise, while we're on the topic of VC, slide 19 I thought was really useful. So the way we're receiving, for example, voluntary concession money today does not match this pie chart, right? So based on where our capital needs are, which is huge in transportation, and acknowledging the fact that we're getting lots of grant funding, affordable housing, I think, recently has gotten center stage in terms of our share of VCs, but a large part of the other parts of the capital are not kind of where the CIP needs. So I think this is really more food for thought for the rest of us to think about making sure that as we think about using VCs strategically, that is allocated to the areas that have the greatest community need. And those needs, frankly, shift over time. Obviously, lots in stormwater and transportation. And so to the extent that we can think about using VCs creatively, I think that's important. And then a couple of specific questions. In the past, we've talked about needing to make a trade-off between the W&OD crossings and then the broad hawk signals. Based on reading the snapshot and then the staff report, is that now resolved pending kind of procurement resources, or is that still something that you need us to resolve in this upcoming budget?
Now, in working with the Public Works Director, I think we're back in a good position where we can sequence them and work them both.
Okay.
I was looking
And
to
when
see, I don't see Zach on, but Ali Kavari, our CIP manager, is available. If I don't say anything correctly.
Cindy, I'm on.
There you are. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm probably hitting at the bottom of the list. So good evening, everybody. Yes, Ms. Mester summarized it very well. We are currently recruiting for another, I guess I'll call it a contract specialist position. That will allow us to do 2 federal procurements concurrently. Right now, we were able to do 1 at a time. So we were able to do 2 a year, but they were consecutive. This additional position will bring that number up to 4 a year with 2 concurrently. So we are currently expecting both the Hawk and the dual trail crossings to go out and hit the street for requesting bids in FY23. I will not say that that's going to happen on the same day, but they will both be in the same fiscal year.
Great. That is great news, Zach. Thank you. And is that something that you need us to act on in the FY23 budget, or you're already funded to take care of that new procurement position?
I believe we are already funded on that. If Ms. Bawa is on, she is welcome to jump in and correct me if I've misspoke on that.
I'll take silence as the confirmation.
You're good, Zach.
Okay. Street lights. I think I read again from the staff report that we were expected to see the pilot of that by now. Is that going to be announced soon, or do we know when we'll have those pilot streets? I know it's something that we've taken interest in
Zach?
the community.
Yes, another great question. So as typical with what seems to be anything that is traffic signal or street light related, we are seeing some extreme lead times right now. We do have several dozen lights into Dominion for request for swapping out. I believe that happened about 4 to 6 weeks ago, and at the time we were told we would see 16 or so week lead time on that, just for Dominion to receive the material, and then they would need to coordinate installation. If I had to guess tonight, I would say we're probably 4 months from today before Dominion gets to installing those, just with lead times of the lights from the manufacturers.
Wow. And that's just for the pilot. It's not the citywide implementation of the LED.
Correct. That is just for the pilots. So what we'll do is once we're up, we have kind of a 30-day trial period, so to speak, to see which brightnesses of the lights, which color temperature of the lights. And then after that, we'll take any feedback. And after that, we will release the rest of the lights to Dominion. Again, I would expect the same lead times as of right now. There's no indication that those are going to improve, at least as of today.
Okay. I've got a couple more that I know have been longstanding priorities of council, but I didn't see any new funding for. So one that we've talked about all consistently is kind of exploring the transition to a green fleet. I know that's something that the Plan Commission has asked about. I think we've asked about whether police, I think we've got a couple cars on order, but is there a plan and then money allocated for out years of what that transition might look like?
Cindy, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me start with that and then you can supplement. I think part of it you will see under the other capital replacement investment where we're starting to have annual allocation for IT equipment, fields, and courts. It will provide the funding for that. And then Public Works and Police and Sheriff, all the folks that run vehicles for the city are looking at what's available for green fleet, whether it's hybrid, electrical, different batteries, and equipment, and to develop that plan. I will note that Mr. Bradley and I are looking at EV fleet for Public Works to be one of our upcoming submissions to Congressman Byer for his community requests to further that effort, as well as the schools are submitting a grant application under the Warner infrastructure for EVs. So we're still pursuing it while concurrently trying to build a more strategic, holistic plan. Anything to add, Zach?
I think that was a pretty good summary, Ms. Mester. I would note that for the city fleet, we have what I like to refer to as a heavy and a light side. Our heavy side are kind of our snow removal vehicles, right? So there are big CDL class trucks, there are hauling trucks, plow trucks, so on and so forth. Based on what the market has right now, there are not any EV options that are viable for us. They do exist, but based off of mileage, charge time, so on and so forth. One, we don't have the physical space to hold enough trucks to run those operations. And two, by the time we outfit them with the way we need them, we do violate quite a few warranties on the truck. So, you know, we have our eye on that heavy side. There are some upstarts that are working on some developments. I'm pretty optimistic in the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to see something. We're going to be able to kind of get something in the city to try that. As far as the light side, those are more the, you know, the half-ton trucks, kind of the day-to-day runners for the inspector, stuff like that. There are several options that have come up in the last really 18 months or so, right? We've got the Ford Lightnings, there's hybrid Ford Mavericks. There's a bunch of stuff out there that fit those needs. And as Ms. Mester mentioned, we are looking at applying for a grant to fill that lighter side of the city's fleet, especially in DPW. And then we're looking at some other options in terms of a kind of a motor pool theory rather than each department having cars. And again, that once we're able to develop that, we would be looking at those hybrid or EV vehicles, depending on the needs of each department.
Great. And perhaps we can spend more time on it because I know there's a lot of interest when we talk about kind of the environmental strategic plan and how this can be part of that broader investment. Two other
If I
things.
could just real quick, I wanted to add that's certainly a focus of ESC and the Planning Commission, and just participated in Northern Virginia Transportation Authority's annual sort of conference, and it was all focused on EV and hydrogen batteries and sort of where things are going in the field. And looks like there's quite a bit of focus on sort of the bus route, and working with WMATA would be our avenue there, as well as the other localities. It does seem like, but the heavy kind of equipment that Zach was describing, I haven't seen it in a dump truck yet, but at least on the buses side, they may be going more for battery and other types of battery than a straight electric vehicle. So I think it's really prudent for us to be tracking this and looking at it and see sort of where the industry is playing out so we get the best solution for the city.
Thank you. Two things that I think will emerge from the council priorities, and I think were also reflected in the Planning Commission's comments, is one on sidewalk obstructions. I know we have the new money allocated in the sidewalk program, and I think I've seen the staff recommendations of where to complete some missing links. Do we have money in the CIP in the coming, say, several years to take care of the, I guess, most glaring sidewalk obstructions, especially in the main commercial corridors?
Let me start, and then I'll pass the baton to Mr. Bradley. Certainly for Park Avenue, Great Street, because that project is removing the utility poles and guy wires from State Theater to the library and finishing the library poles that we weren't able to do during the library part of the project. So that'll be one of our big commercial areas for sure. And certainly with the sidewalk money that we have allocated, if there's any impediment at that point, we will do that. Any of the intersection work will move poles out of sidewalks. So there's a fair amount of investment. There's not a standalone project that would say we're going to remove every Dominion and communication pole and every sidewalk. That's going to take quite a bit of dollars and work, but I think we have a fair amount commitment to some core areas. Bradley?
What about Broad Street, Cindy? Does it have to wait for the Broad Street multimodal, or do we have money set aside for a couple of the big ones on Broad?
There's not money set aside for Broad for just undergrounding. if that's a specific question. I know we have some around churches and we have some conduits that we'd have to look at.
I don't know what the right approach is. If it's undergrounding, I mean, obviously underground is really expensive, which is why we wait for these bigger projects and bigger grant funds. But the two in particular that I know have been raised is Betos repeatedly now for at least the 6 years I've been on council, and then Park Place, the two poles that are orphaned after the Insight project is not taking care of them. So I'd like to figure out somewhere money that we can take care of those three, because I feel like those are big misses in our main commercial areas.
Those we have under control and take care of. So with the Broad Street project, it will do the Betos piece. And I'll let Zach speak to any more details on that. And then for the Park Place ones, we've expanded the Park Avenue Great Street scope. So it will pick up those orphan poles. We won't just end at North Washington and Park Avenue.
That's great. What about the Betos one? When does that get taken care of?
Can you speak to more details on the Betos one with the Broad Street project?
Yeah, so the Betos pole will be taken care of under the West Broad Street multimodal. We are at 60% design submission to VDOT. I don't have a great feel for right-of-way impacts off the top of my head. I believe we minimize them as much as possible while still trying to get the sidewalks and the Betos issue and a few other things resolved while we're out there. Once we're able to obtain that 100% design, we'll be able to move into right-of-way. We'll acquire the necessary property from Betos, and that will be part of that project.
And what's the best case scenario and when actually goes into construction?
To be honest, I don't have a great feel for that tonight. That's something that I can sit down with our CIP manager and we can work through. I don't want to kind of shoot from the hip with some of the recent VDOT lead times we've been seeing once we get out of design. So I don't want to misspeak tonight and promise something that's not feasible.
Got it. No, that's fair. I think to Dave Snyder's point, I think there's certainly just desire across the community and from council to kind of do more faster. And those sidewalk obstructions are just the most visible ones to the community. So when we talk about prioritizing pedestrians because they're in our commercial areas, it would be great if there was a way to pull them forward out of the bigger Broad Street program and just take care of them. Like, hey, we're committed to sidewalks, committed to accessibility. We're just going to do it. And so if there's grant funds and local funds to take care of it, I think there's council support. The last one, and I won't take up any more time, is funding 1 mile of protected bike lanes. I think that's something that we've talked about doing in the past, and I know that we've identified potentially maybe Lincoln Avenue, or I don't know if Great Streets on Park is going to take care of it, or if it's going to continue to be Sharrows. But somewhere in the CIP, I feel like needs to reflect what their emerging council priorities are, and I expect that will be one of the things that comes out of that 2-year work plan we have. So maybe a bookmark for how we can take care of that in the CIP. That's it. Thank you very much.
All right, Mary Beth.
Thank you. A few things. When I was first on city council, we never even had money to put in PAYGO. And I remember that being a huge issue the first few years I was on council. So just in PAYGO, we've come a long way. But I also remember when we were worried that we had so much money going into our large capital projects that we weren't going to be able to do anything else. And indeed, we are doing a ton. So thank you to staff and everyone who has gotten these grants and is implementing these grants and has a vision for how we're going to be able to keep doing a lot of stuff. A couple questions. Number one, the equity and environmental lenses. You mentioned in your presentation, Cindy, the environmental lens. And since I don't have a copy of the CIP book yet, is the equity lens in that book? Because I feel like those are really important things that we need to keep emphasizing to the community as well.
Yes, they will be in the full book when you go under the tabs for the project. So if you picked 10 for stormwater, the first page for stormwater flood remediation will be the project, descriptions, the dollar amount, compliance. Second page will be combined both the equity and the environmental lens, so you can see it in one view. I will suggest that you do it electronically because in print it's small and so it's easier to enlarge on screen, but it is there. So there's 5 questions, 3 for equity and 2 for environmental.
You're muted, I think.
Sorry, I'm glad that all those projects are going through those two lenses. Regarding sidewalks, Letty mentioned impediments in sidewalks. I'm just wondering about brick sidewalks. We've heard from community members about how brick sidewalks are slippery and uneven and difficult to navigate if you are handicapped or need accessibility. Have we looked at that at all? Going forward, do we really want to keep adding brick sidewalks that aren't the safest option around?
I can defer to Mr. Bradley on that. I know he's been assessing material and construction of both crosswalks and sidewalks. Not sure if you have anything specific to add tonight, or we can follow up.
Maybe I'll just jump in and note, we do follow the streetscape standards, and those were adopted by the city council. So that might be a council work plan item if the council wants to take a second look at that. The ones that probably from a public works perspective were the most keeping an eye on are the ones that actually cross the right of way. The bricks that cross the street are going to become a bigger and bigger maintenance issue for the city. And that's one we want to give the council some data on, just so that the eyes are open in terms of what the long-term cost of that will be. But for now, we're following the streetscape standards is the short answer.
Okay. I appreciate that, but I would appreciate that we look at that going forward in the CIP or in council policy, because it does seem like we have all these things and they're causing impediments as the bricks move and shift. So that's another question. The putting ARPA money into the capillary food bank, I'm really glad that we are participating on that region-wide. Is that what other jurisdictions are doing, using ARPA money to pay for that?
Yes, they are. And I'll note, just for accounting purposes, we started that in the CIP and it's actually moved to your operating budget, but it's still the same funding source. It'll just show up on the operating budget.
Okay. And then my last question is about the C&D and CIE. I had questions about that to begin with. So I didn't remember ever talking about C&I in the past, and then Mr. Shields presented on it last week and had it in the budget. But your slide with the CIE and the C&E, I'm just a little confused. So I know we've got a lot more to go through tonight, but that is one that I just need a little more explanation on. I think others do too, to explain exactly what that is and what we're getting into with this, since it's something we haven't talked about before.
So on this chart, maybe one way to look at it, from the simplest perspective, the C&I tax of 5 cents will, for the business community, appear to be new. And I do have a meeting planned with the Chamber of Commerce to discuss it if the council does proceed with this proposal. And we'll meet with the EDA tomorrow night also to discuss it. What Cindy was laying out there is that we have been funding the C&I equivalent for years. And you could really take that 12.5 cents and multiply it by $80,000, because that's what 12.5 cents just on commercial would generate. And that's, if you can recall all the past years where we've been funding WMATA and WMATA capital costs and things like that, that's now sort of built into the tax rate. And, the year after year of increased WMATA costs, that's where the lion's share of that 12.5 cents of C&I equivalent have gone. And that's freed up additional 30% money that we then deploy locally for good projects throughout the city. So I think that's the point that we're trying to make with this side. We've been trying to fund transportation this way, where everybody pays. And this year, particularly just given the big sharp increases on the residential side and the relatively flat assessments, which have been the case really now for many years in a row on the commercial side, that from a perspective of just trying to keep things affordable on the residential side, that's why we brought this proposal forward to help fund our transportation program.
And if I can, Mr. Shields, the only thing I would add is that this 12.5 cents is the maximum under state code. You need to do that dedicated into the Special Transportation Fund, which we do, and that's what allows us to draw down our 30% NVTA So you leverage it to get that transportation money. If you did neither of these, you would lose the full 30%.
Thank you for that additional point, Cindy.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'm sure I'll have other questions on that one in the future, but that's a good start. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Ms. Connolly, for that question. I have the exact same question on the CNI. So I'll put a marker in for us to talk about that further. I look forward to hearing what the EDA has to say and what the chamber has to say. My concern would be for the impact on the small businesses who I presume would get this tax passed through to them at a time when a lot of small businesses are either struggling or just getting back up on their feet. I think I'm not sure this is the best year to be starting something new, but I'm certainly interested in learning more about it and discussing it. I'd like to maybe consider whether it could in some way be connected to the B poll tax. If there's an increase in one area, perhaps an offsetting decrease in another area would help our small businesses carry through to better times ahead. It's the kind of thing that after we talk about it this week, I'd like to hear what others think about perhaps putting it in the study bucket and considering it's not all that much money. I mean, $400,000 is not nothing, but it's, 4/5 of a cent on the tax rate. So just not, given all the other things that are going on, not sure it's a new endeavor that couldn't wait for a year until we sort of understand it better and understand its implications better. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Duncan. So, Mr. Shields, let me ask you this. There are a number of other items, sort of sub-items here, sub-buckets about the budget and tax and fee structures. Did you have presentations or your staff have presentations on those other items?
We do not. We don't plan to walk through them in detail. They're there for council to have a preview and to discuss before the meeting next week, where we'll ask for first reading on these. And so we anticipated that there would be a discussion of the CNI overlay ordinance. And so that is one of the items that the council will be asked to take first reading on. And so that slide provided some additional information on that. Maybe for the rest of them, maybe we'll just ask if council has any questions or discussion or direction for staff in preparing these ordinances.
Let me ask you, before you do that, could you quickly just go through, I mean, some of these are sort of basically obvious, but maybe for the benefit of the public, just each different item and sort of what's proposed? Again, I think just for the benefit of listeners, the public as a whole, or the newspaper, or whatever it might be, just so everyone has a full picture of the, charges, proposals to change those charges, keep them flat for each of the items quickly.
Absolutely. So the budget ordinance, the first item is the spending plan for the, I'm sorry, Cindy, could you go back, could you just go back to the list? I'm not going to walk through them all individually. Thank you. So the budget ordinance is really the spending plan for the year. So that was the presentation last Monday. And the next item is the CIP, and that's the presentation tonight that Cindy Mester just walked us through. And so the ordinance would appropriate the dollars for FY23 and then adopt a plan for the subsequent 5 years for a 6-year capital improvements program. We have then the real estate and personal property tax ordinance. So for personal property, the rate would stay unchanged at $5 per $100 of assessed value. For real estate, the rate would be reduced by 8.5 cents to a rate of $1.23.5. The commercial and industrial overlay ordinance would set a real estate tax rate of 5 cents per $100 of assessed value, and that would apply to commercial and industrial properties only in the city, and can be the results of that $403,000 per year can be used exclusively for transportation expansion purposes. In other words, new capacity in the transportation network. The last two items, the sanitary sewer ordinance would be a 3% increase to the sanitary sewer rate. And then the last item would be a 3% stormwater fee ordinance. The rationale for both of those is to keep up with operating cost expenses that both of those two enterprise funds are facing. So that's a summary, and be happy to provide any additional detail. And Ms. Bawa is on the call and certainly can provide more detail as well.
All right, Ms. Hardy.
A question on the C&I tax. So I know that the code prohibits us from levying that on residential properties, which is why mixed use was excluded. Is there a way for us to separate between the ground floor of mixed use that has commercial versus the upper floors, which is residential, and levy that tax on only the ground floor component and therefore not do the full 5 cents? Like if we're spread it out among a bigger tax base, the impact is much smaller.
So there might be some exceptions to this rule, but I think in every instance where there's a mixed-use building, the retail is condominiumized, and so it has a separate fee ownership structure than the rest of the residential portion of the building. So that first floor retail would be subject to this tax. The residential above it would not. Ms. Bawa, if I misspoke, please correct me.
That's my understanding as well in the calculation.
So we're already levying it on the ground floor of those mixed use. It's not just pure 100% commercial properties.
Yeah, because it's the retail is a condominium, that would be viewed as a pure residential property. I mean, a pure commercial property.
Okay, I was under the impression that it was only on the non-mixed use commercial parts of town, but it sounds like it's the ground floor of mixed use is also already will get this tax if we.
It's on all. Sorry, it's on all commercial businesses minus multifamily units that are excluded.
So just
If
floors.
the commercial business happens to be in a multi-use development, it's still considered commercial, and that retail would be levied this tax.
So if they're inside, say, the Spectrum, the ground floor gets this tax.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
I'm quite sure that is correct, but if there's any additional nuance to that, we'll certainly get that information to council.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone have further questions or comments or requests for information before we move on from this item? Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. This is the time in the movie when Phil brings up the uncomfortable question of what would the budget tax rate be if we were to vote on it tonight. I know we're all concerned about taxpayers, and we all want all the information that we can possibly get before we make our final decision. And I know that there are still some things up in the air this time around that we may not know until late April. So given all that, and yet at the level that the manager has proposed, someone in, let's just say, my position, occupying a house worth just slightly less than $1 million, which is by no means a mansion, the proposed tax rate would give me a tax bill something along the order of $2,000 some more than last year, even with the 123.5 rate. And so I know I'm not alone in this. I've heard anecdotally and gotten communications from others, as I'm sure you all have. And so I'd like to at least have folks thinking in their mind that next week, if we could pick a number that's closer to 120, even at that rate, tax bill for somebody in my position would be almost $700 more than last year. And that's no small amount of money either. I would like us to at least have that in our heads as we head into next Monday for a vote on setting the maximum tax rate as a signal that we would be sending to the citizens that we understand the impact of the assessments on many households across the city. Thanks.
Mr. Snyder?
Sure. Well, I think those proposing a lower tax rate should then indicate what will they not fund. because I think that's a reasonable question if we're going to make a reasonable decision on that. And there are a lot of uncertainties here. Now, look, you know, I want a lower tax rate, so does everybody. And we'll get to the lowest point responsible. But I do think for those who are proposing a rate different from the city manager, then I think they ought to propose what would be removed from the city manager's budget. I think that makes it a fulsome, useful exercise. Thank you.
Ms. Hardy, then Ms. Hiscott.
Thank you. I think what would be helpful for the discussion before next week is, I think one of the questions I had asked over email is, what is the range of kind of the plus or minus of kind of uncertainties we have out there? And then for that contingency list, I know you identified $1 million of kind of set aside for us to fund, you know, either further tax rate decreases or bogeys that we don't know out there, or projects that, for example, assisting with refugees. If that's something that is on that contingency list for us to decide, it would be helpful for us to have both those things for us to kind of mull over how much room we have on the budget as you proposed. Thank you.
Ms. Hiscott?
So I agree with both those additional comments from Letty and Mr. Schneider. I just also wanted to throw in there on that contingency fund, addressing, looking at the tax deferral program. We have a pretty great tax deferral program for those on fixed income. They're not all of our jurisdictions nearby have the deferral and not having to pay until you either pass away or sell your home. And we talked a couple of times about adding those who truly can't afford, like adding some affordability level to that, some income level to that. So fixed income, seniors, and perhaps some additional. So I may have missed that in all the presentation if we already have some of that information, because I think that helps with some carve out for those most impacted.
All right. Unless there's any additional comments, let's move on to the Westfall senior housing proposal. Mr. Shields?
Okay, thank you, Counsel. And so we've taken note of those, the budget questions, and we'll be continuing to work on responses to those Counsel questions. So we will transition now to the senior component to the Westfalls project, and Emily Bazemore is our senior planner and lead planner for this case. She will introduce it for us. She will make a couple of notes that this is the site plan process. We don't have any new VCs for this, and it's really kind of embedded in the approvals that the City Council granted last August. So we do think that this will be a simpler process than some of the, other special exceptions that we've had in the past. This is the kind of the classic site plan process, which for the first time the City Council is approving at the Westfalls project. So let me turn it over to Ms. Bazemore, and she will provide a staff report. We are joined by the development team, which is TC Mid-Atlantic. And I want to thank them for being on the call. They're represented in this case by the Venable Law Firm, and I think they're going to give the presentation tonight. But let's first hear from Ms. Bazemore, and then she will transition it over to the presenters for the development team. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. I will be presenting the staff report very briefly, and like Mr. Shields said, punting it over to the applicant team to give their introductions and their presentation. So beginning on line 4 of the staff report, we have the request of council. So tonight, council is requested to hold a work session to discuss and provide feedback for the Westfalls Special Exception Site Plan Block D1 Senior Housing application on file by TC Mid-Atlantic. This Sesp application is a follow-up application to the special exception entitlement that council approved for this site back on August 9th, 2021. The approval of the SEE established the allowable use, which is senior housing, building footprint, building height, and other general design elements. The SESP application addresses final architecture, final site design, and engineering. Recommendations. Staff recommends that council reviews and provides feedback on the SESP application on file for the 15-story senior housing building within the Westfalls Economic Development Project. Getting into the application status on line 20, on February 16th, 2022, TC Mid-Atlantic filed a complete SESP application for part of Block D1 of the Westfall's Church Economic Development Project pursuant to Section 48-486C in conformance with procedures set forth in Section 48-488B for the development proposal. City staff reviewed the complete development application, and we held a development review committee meeting with the applicant team back on March 16th of 2022. City staff subsequently issued a comments letter to the applicant team on March 23rd. Getting into application summary, again, our applicant is TC Mid-Atlantic. And our site, beginning on line 35, Block D, is part of the approximately 9.78 acre Westfall's Economic Development Project. Block D1 is located at the northeast corner of the project site at the intersection of Westfall Station Boulevard and Mustang Alley. Building uses: a mixed-use building with a maximum height of 15 stories and 267,900 feet comprised of the following uses is proposed. We have 260,000 gross square feet of residential use and a maximum of 212 homes, which include 22 memory care units, they're studio units, 58 assisted living units, and 132 independent living units, along with 79,000 gross square feet of ground floor retail. The ground floor will include 2 retail bays, a kitchen, a restaurant, and amenity spaces. Floors 2 through 15 of the building will include residential units, amenity spaces, and building staff offices. 20% of the roof space will be a green roof per the voluntary concessions submitted and accepted as part of the SEE for the site. Landowners, the history of land ownership and how things got to the city is discussed from line 54 to line 62 of the staff report. We have our land use and zoning noted on line 65 to 69. Block D is currently undeveloped, but the current zoning is B2 central business. The comprehensive plan, the future land use map designation is mixed use, and it's within a special revitalization district for education and economic development. Moving on to line 71, land use actions requested with the SESP. So again, pursuant to Section 48-488B of the zoning code, properties in areas designated special exception or special revitalization district for education and economic development and designated for mixed use development on the future land use planning map may be subject to a 2-step process as set forth below. An SEE entitlement to determine the layout, the heights, and general uses, and then a special exception site plan SESP, which shall function as any other special exception and site plan approved under the zoning ordinance, and which will establish final design. When a special exception entitlement has been approved for a property, development on that property can then proceed only after a special exception site plan has been approved. So approval of an SESP, the City Council has the authority to approve the SESP application following a mandatory recommendation by the Planning Commission. City Council may adopt conditions as part of its approval to ensure that the project will meet standards for exterior and interior details, as well as other site plan specific elements. Considerations for the evaluation of SESP applications. Again, City Council should rely on the Planning Commission and staff in determining if site plan requirements and considerations have been met. As part of staff's analysis, we look at guiding documents. This begins on line 97 of the staff report, such as the comprehensive plan, small area plans, design guidelines, streetscape standards, our zoning ordinance, and other applicable codes to complete our evaluation. The elements of the SESP shall comply in all respects with the approved SEE, including any amendments approved by Council. Beginning on line 103 of the staff report, we have some of the history of previous applications and Council actions. So we have on July 8th, 2019, City Council approved the SEE for the Westfall's Economic Development Project for a new mixed-use district adjacent to the city's new high school and proximate to the Westfall Church Metro. Beginning on lines 111, we have Council approving the SEE amendment for the entirety of Phase 1 and an SESP application for Phase 1, except the senior housing building on August 9th of 2021. The SEE amendment included a request to increase the maximum gross square footage limit of the senior housing building to accommodate the needs of senior housing development or the senior housing development partner. An additional 35,000 gross square feet was approved to be added to the previous maximum limit of 225,000 gross square feet for a new maximum of 260,000 gross square feet. The additional gross square feet include an additional floor of height. So we went from 14 stories to 15 stories, and the 15-story allowance is within the 15-story limitation set out by the zoning code. We had the Planning Commission motion listed beginning on line 132. And then beginning after the Planning Commission review, we have our staff analysis. We start off with site characteristics, moving into our senior housing building refinements, which starts on line 188. Don't want to spend too much time on this as the applicant team is going to note this in their presentation. But as part of the council meeting back on June of 2020 or June 2021, a presentation was given on the preliminary architectural design for the senior housing building. There have been changes to the architectural design. We went from a red brick material to a more white gray brick material. You can see on the staff report on lines 199 and 202 the changes. Yeah, the changes in the renderings, very nice images that kind of point those out. We also had a change in unit count, unit size. Unit count, nothing too substantial. We went from 215 to 212. And we also had a slight change in parking. For the comprehensive plan analysis, that begins on line 221. And then we also have an analysis of urban design guidelines and looking at past ULI TAP study, which begins on line 296. Again, going through comprehensive planning goals, they begin on line 330, and then moving into our special exception site plan analysis, which we go through the primary criteria and then secondary criteria. This begins on line 395 of the staff report. To wrap up my presentation, I have two more things. Line 555, the fiscal impact analysis. After further discussion between planning and the EDO, staff does not believe it is necessary to rerun the FIA as the change in unit count is so minor. And then timing. So right now we're with you guys in your first work session on April 4th of 2022. We anticipate coming back on April 25th for a first reading and then a boards and commissions referral. Something important to note about the boards and commissions that will be seeing this project. We're only including the code required boards and commissions. So we have the Economic Development Authority, which is, of course, part of the land ownership group, and then the Architectural Advisory Board for architecture changes, and then the Urban Forestry Commission will be seeing this as well, in addition to the Planning Commission. We have a second council work session noted for July 18th of 2022, and then a City Council reading and final action for the beginning of August, specifically August 8th of 2022. That concludes my run through of the staff report. I'd like to turn it over to the applicant team now for some introductions and their presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Bazemore, for that very thorough presentation. So now to the development team, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I look forward to hearing about your revised proposal.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. My name is Matthew Allman. I'm a land use attorney with Venable LLP in Tysons, Virginia. Very pleased to be here this evening on behalf of Trammell Crow, the developer of the senior housing building. As staff, I'll introduce the rest of the team before I move on. Also with us this evening, we have our architect from Perkins Eastman, as well as our civil engineer from Walter L. Phillips and several folks from Trammell Crow as well. So we'll give a very brief presentation, and then we've got the whole team here available to help answer questions.
All right,
As
thank you.
staff noted, the most recent activity on this project occurred in August of 2021 with the SEE amendment. There were several high-level planning details that were adjusted as part of that approval, but much of the individual site and building design details, the specifics, were left to a future SESP application, which is what we've now requested. In a moment, the design team will walk through the slideshow that's on the screen and show you the latest design and also highlight for you some of the changes from the prior zoning entitlements and where we are today. But before we do that, I do think it's worth spending at least a moment on the things that have not changed and the details of the master plan that are being implemented as part of this proposal. Some of those details include the use of the site for senior living and retail uses, compliance with maximum and minimum standards for building height and density, the design details for the streetscape and public realm, as well as the siting of the building on the block and how the building interacts with the public realm from an access and circulation standpoint, parking details and how the parking will be in the shared garage adjacent to the building, as well as the details of the voluntary concessions. The design team will also spend a moment speaking to you about the additional 35,000 square feet that was conceptually approved back in August of 2021, and the latest thinking on how that square footage can best be implemented in the new building. And as you'll hear, as the senior housing market has continued to evolve and adapt in relation to the public health challenges, the latest thinking is that that space is best allocated towards larger units for the residents. So I'll pause here and turn it over to Perkins Eastman. But again, we have the whole team here, and very pleased to be with you and pleased to have some Q&A with you after the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome to our architects.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can.
Great. This is Gary Steiner. I'm principal with Perkins Eastman Architects, and I've spoken with you before, and what I want to show you tonight are the most recent updates to our project as they relate to the SESP application that's in process right now. Next slide, please. So we're talking about the D1 parcel, and really there's nothing changed in terms of the use characteristics on the D1 parcel from what was originally approved. It is a full block footprint with a horseshoe-shaped tower, or U-shape or C-shape, whichever you prefer, that sits above it. So in terms of where the SESP was and where we are now, there are no changes at the ground plane. Next slide, please. So the sugar cube diagrams, as we refer to these, in the original SCSP, there was nothing more than a white mass indicated for the development of the senior living building. Now we've filled in the detail on the images on the right-hand side of the page, and you can see a building that's been developed with a residential character. We've noted 4 different things that are different from the original SCSP. Conceptually, again, it is still a C-shaped building that faces the courtyard facing Commons Boulevard. But item number 1, we made the center bar, or the long wing of the C, wider to allow better residential units to occur in the corridors on the residential floors. We've made the top floor of the building just the center bar itself, that straight bar that runs across the building. And that helps to create articulation at the skyline, which reduces the effective visual mass of the building. And it also gives us some very nice roof terraces on the 14th floor for our amenity space. We've created a mechanical yard on top of the penthouse floor, on top of the 15th floor. That's where all our rooftop mechanical equipment will be, and our elevator overrides and those things. They're within a screen wall, so nothing that's on the roof will be seen from the ground. And then the last thing we've done, which is significant, is that we've added balconies to the building on our independent living floors 7 through 14. So previously, our building did not have balconies, and now we do. And we believe that that's a great benefit to our residents. It provides them outdoor access, it provides light and air, and it helps to articulate the building. Next slide, please. So this is just another view of the building, and okay, we can stop here. This is great. So when we talked to you about the SEE amendment and the addition of the 35,000 square feet last year, the image on the left is where we were, and we were talking about a building that was 2 colors of brick, red and buff. But since then, we've had some change of thought about the materiality of the building, in large part because of construction sequencing and the ability to get the building built quicker, and that way we can minimize the impact to the rest of Westfall's development. So now we're talking about an architectural precast material, not a brick material, and we're looking at tones of light gray and dark gray, mainly because architectural precast, which is a very handsome material, which will allow us more depth and shadow and variation in the facade of the building, but it's a material that doesn't look good in red tones. And since there are precedents in the development for gray and white buildings, as well as red and buff buildings, we didn't feel like the red and buff was any longer appropriate. So we've transitioned to a light gray, dark gray kind of a material. And the next slide shows our building from 2 views, both from Commons Boulevard, but you can see the 2 materials in the center of the building that we're proposing. They are stone-like material, but they're actually precast concrete. We're still doing the 2-story reed on the building, so the light gray bands and the dark gray receding tones still work the same way that they did when we had a red brick building, but instead we're going with these grays, which are more sedate. The street life is just as lively as it was before. We'll retain the canopies around the perimeter of the building. And other than that, the building is really conceptually still the same. Next slide. In terms of use and function for the project, changes have been minimal since we were last back to see you for the SEE in August. The top left diagram, which is mostly gray, is our basement. It is primarily back of house service and support. So all of our electrical and mechanical service rooms, our maintenance, bicycle parking, staff facilities are all down in the basement level. The ground floor plan, which is in the lower left, shows the entry to the senior living building at the very center in the middle on axis with the center line of the building, sort of above the letter E in amenities right there. And the senior living function then is off to the left-hand side, with the 2 major amenity spaces on this floor being the living room and the restaurant, which is served by the kitchen in the back of the building on the alley in the gray. The other primary function on this floor is the blue color, which is the retail space, and that is unchanged in terms of its relationship to the street frontages and its access to the sidewalks. The second floor of the building in the upper right is amenity space for the independent living and assisted living residents in the building. And there's also a handful of residential units, independent living units, in the bottom right-hand corner. There's the 2-story open spaces, which are the white areas, which allow for dynamic spaces to occur where our primary amenity spaces are. And then on the 3rd floor, which is the lower right, is our memory care floor. This is the 3rd floor. It consists of 22 studio units clustered in a loop-type setting, so we have a perimeter wandering path for the residents. And then the pink spaces indicate amenity spaces that let light through the building from the front to the back. And then at the bottom of the page, above the words memory care units, is an outdoor courtyard for the memory care residents. It's secured on 3 sides of the building by the faces of the building itself, and on the bottom side of the page by a tall wall with an trellis in it that is secure and does not allow residents to escape. So the memory care floor has its own amenity spaces and its service and support spaces, which are in the purple and gray, and it's totally self-sufficient and secure. Next slide, please. The fourth floor is the primary assisted living amenity floor. It also has about 10 assisted living residential units as well. Those are in the yellow color. But the pink spaces, which are primarily amenity spaces for the 3 floors of assisted living, comprise of dining, living, activity, games, theater, wellness, and then in the gray and dark blue colors, there are service and support spaces. The 5th and 6th floors are assisted living residents primarily in the bottom left-hand floor plan, but we've gone ahead and given each of these 2 floors an additional gathering or amenity space right off the elevator course so that they're functional and accessible. That's correct. So the 2 assisted living floors on 5 and 6 have 21 residential units each. They're a combination of studios and 1-bedrooms, and then they do have their own amenity space on each of those 2 floors. When we get to the 7th floor, which is independent living, top right, now you can start to see the balconies occurring. Most of the units have balconies, not quite all, but we don't have balconies below this level because the assisted living and memory care units should not have balconies. But you have 16 residential units on each of these 8 floors. They range from 1 bedroom to 2 bedrooms. And then on the very top floor, our penthouse level, or 15, is primarily amenity spaces, a lounge, fitness, wellness, swimming pool and locker rooms, activity and games, as well as 2 roof terraces, one off the Sky Lounge on the left side, and one off the swimming pool on the right side. Next slide. Changes to the program since we last talked. We are talking now about 206 units, but may in fact drift up to the 212 that was previously discussed in the text. We've also added bike parking at the bottom of the page. We have calculated our parking on the basis of retail for obviously the retail uses, and because there is not a senior living use in the bike parking ordinance, we've chosen the hotel use to be most similar, and we've sized our bike parking accordingly. In the box at the top of the page, we talk about the size of the project. We've already addressed the fact that the building was approved to be 260,000 square feet, which is where we are. And currently we are at 206 units, but may in final design increase a few more, but certainly stay below the 225 that was in the original SCE, and probably below the 212 that was in the one that we were approved back in August. And with that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and open up to City Council questions or comments. Anyone have any comments or questions? Ms. Hardy?
Hi, just a quick one. So I like the change of color from red brick to the white and the gray. Could you describe to me more what the material differences are? So instead of using brick, what exactly is proposed?
So these are what is referred to as architectural precast panels. They're typically large panels, maybe something on the order of 10 by 12, 14 by 16, with the windows built inside of them. So they come and they're hoisted up and welded in place. They have a finish on them that looks somewhat like limestone. So it's a relatively smooth, fine finish. You can see in the 2 little biscuits in the middle of the page there, those are actual samples. They're about 3 by 5 inches each in reality. So it's a nice, rich finish. And there are joints between the panels, but those generally align with windows and floors. And there are not joints like you would have in brickwork every 3 or 4 inches.
Got it. So I'm a fan of the lighter colors. I think it reminds me of the condo building, which I think was done in white, that we were all fans of. So if we have less red brick, I'm totally okay with that. I know the mayor often talks about cementitious panels, and so that would be my only concern is whether that meets our standards. So thank you.
All right, other questions or comments? Remind us of your lead level here on this building.
We will be LEED Gold.
Okay. Mary Beth Conley, you're up.
Just a quick question, and that is, I know you made some changes because of COVID and changes to those different areas. So what you're showing us are a safer way to do assisted living for seniors.
Yes.
Okay. That's my only question. Thanks.
All right. And the operator for this facility?
Yes. So I'm Bill Brewer with Trammell Crow Company. We are trying to work with a group called SRG, Senior Resource Group. They're based out of San Diego, California, and we're partnered with them on our 765 John Carlisle Senior Living Development in Alexandria, Virginia. So we're excited to be working with them.
Got it. And when do you anticipate breaking ground?
We are looking to break ground, call it May of next year. We've actually already released purchase easement and start some design work on the interiors of the buildings, and we intend to progress that during the Sesp process.
Got it. Mr. Shields, could you remind us what our comprehensive agreement requires? What's the deadline for that?
So the outside closing date for the plan for the majority of the leasehold is this April 30th. And then the outside closing date on this senior component is 9 months after that.
So
I'm sorry, I correct myself. It's 10 months after that.
So closing date is required to be something like February of next year?
I believe that is correct.
Okay.
But the 10 months after April 30th is the amendment that was enacted earlier this winter.
Got it. And is there a requirement to commence construction? I don't recall in the comprehensive agreement.
So at closing, similar to the ground lease as a whole, all the financing needs to be in place with the completion guarantees that are required by the through the financing. And so the city does require completion guarantees, but they typically rely upon much of the same documentation, the guarantees that are provided in the financing of the project as a whole.
Got it. So I would ask Mr. Brewer, are you aware of those terms? I presume you are, and you'll be able to meet those.
Yes, sir. We're aware of them, and that's what we're trying to do with the design release.
Got it. Okay. Let's open it up. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, so it looks like a pretty quick review of your proposal. And next steps, Mr. Shields?
Ms. Bazemore, could you just walk us through the next steps in this process? Thank you.
Yeah. So the next steps, we will be coming back to you guys on the 25th of April, but in between, we have some intermittent submissions listed in the timing section. So we have the applicant listed for submission 1.1. With any post-work session changes coming in sometime next week. I believe April 11th is listed. We have a Planning Commission work session noted for May 4th following that Boards and Commissions referral. We also have the EDA, AAB, and UFC meetings throughout May, particularly early May. They wrap up on May 19th. Following all of those boards and commission meetings, we have another submission with changes reflecting any boards and commission comments, and this is right before planning commission action. We have a planning commission action coming up on June 1st, and then a submission number 2 right before council work session number 2 on July 18th. And finally, we have, again, city council second reading and final action for early August, specifically August 8th.
All right, thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. I just want to go back with one question. So there's 7,900 square feet of retail ground floor. Just wondered what the plan is for selecting tenants for that and the build out and the timing of when the ground floor retail would be opening relative to the residential part of the building.
So we would anticipate opening that ground floor retail fairly close to the completion of the tower for fire and life safety reasons. Hopefully, we'd be able to deliver a couple months ahead of time, and then based on our development schedule, call it 24 months from May of 2023, so May 2025.
Okay, great. A couple months ahead of retail or of residential occupancy would be terrific. All right, thank you.
And just one last question. Did I hear there are any changes relating to parking, or was I just kind of lost?
Yeah, so the parking count for the overall project has stayed the same. The allocation of parking spaces to the senior living building, I believe, did increase from like 65 or 75 to 125. And then we worked with P. and Hoffman to provide a certification to city staff that they believe the parking was still adequate for the use of the entire development. So
it sounds like, if I understood what you just said correctly, the amount of parking in the garage, which is a shared garage, will stay the same. However, your allocation of it is going down. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So your building, how many total parking spaces for your building then?
We'll have 125.
Okay. And you've got 206 units, maybe 212 units. What's that?
So we typically size our parking off of our independent living count just because there is no demand on the assisted or memory care.
Although I would say you're going to have employees. I don't know how many employees you intend to have, and then also visitors.
Yep, and that was part of the. We have the visitors will likely use, and we'll have a reimbursement system set up for the transient parking in the garages. It seemed like a retail parker would use those. So that's handled there. And then on the employee side, we expect most folks to come through Metro. And then inside of our 125 spaces, we would allocate a few for retail parking.
Gotcha. And maybe it's a question for staff. Is there a TDM here? In other words, any requirements for that, Metro contributions or the like, to try to encourage people, or for anyone for that matter, to try to get, because I know it's probably fairly labor intensive in terms of number of employees, particularly memory care and some of the other similar uses. I guess I'll just say this. I won't belabor the point. I would just ask staff to review and make sure we're comfortable. We do have a similar product in town, the Kensington. I know at times there's been issues about parking there. And so I guess I would just suggest a request that staff take a look at that, particularly in light of our actual numbers at the Kensington.
Yes, we can do that. Thank you.
Okay. That's all I've got. Anything else from anyone? All right. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and we'll be, I'm sure, talking to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. So I propose we take a short break, a recess for refreshment and the like, and reconvene, let's say at 9:35. Does that work for everybody? All right. I'm going to take that as a yes. So let's take a short break and reconvene at 9:35. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, it's 9:35. Why don't we get back at it and go back into session. We're now on to the T zone conversation. Mr. Shields, is Mr. Stoddard leading this conversation, or who should I turn the floor over to?
Well, thank you, Mayor and members of council. I'll just say a few words of introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Stoddard, who will give the staff presentation. And on the council's work plan for the last 2-year period was to take a look at residential development in the city, including looking at our transition zones. And so we have had 3 work sessions on this, and council's asked us to bring language to you in the form of a zoning text amendment that would reflect some of the council comments in the prior work sessions. I'm going to turn it over to Paul, but I do want to just note Paul and the zoning administrator, Mr. John Boyle, have worked on this language, and I want to thank them for their hard work and thoughtfulness on this. The last time we did a zoning text amendment, we did have a planner, Carly Aubrey, work the case all the way through with the zoning administrator and also with the help of an outside consultant, Susan Bell. And because of the work we do have right now on current planning, we were not able to assign a planner full time to this. And Susan Bell also is no longer taking this type of work. She's retired, and so she's enjoying her retirement. But I do want to just note that for the council, that in terms of supporting this effort, I just want to acknowledge that up front, that it really has been an effort by, I think, a smaller team than we've typically had. And our planning director, in fact, has had kind of the key role in trying to bring this forward because we've not been able to assign additional staff to it. That said, we do have language for you. We'd like to review it with you and get your feedback on that. And let me turn it over to Mr. Stoddard for a layout of what we have worked out in terms of actual code language.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Manager. Thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council. I'll walk through the staff report briefly. I'll touch on the items that are new since you've last seen this and summarize the items you've seen previously. So the request for council tonight, as Mr. Shields pointed out, staff does have ready for your review draft code language as you had requested. And so the request of you all tonight is provide direction back to staff on that draft code. You can see it there beginning on line 3 of the staff report. Thank you, Cindy. The specific questions council thought could be used to seed the conversation, although obviously staff's looking for feedback on any portion of the draft code. Any direction council could provide on permissible uses, the form of the building, the layout of the site, and then one that I know will get certainly some questions, the approval process in the draft code, and I'll speak to this in a bit. Staff has put forward 2 options for how an approval process for a project in the T zones could work, whether it would be by right or by council review. Background section, I'm going to jump down to line 14. And this section, at least this first paragraph of it, this list of it, is going to highlight the changes that have been made since council has last seen this material. For reference, your last work session on the T-zones was on January 18th of this year. The enumerated list beginning on line 18 walks through some of the key points of the available code language, the suggested code language. First off is consolidating the T1 and T2 zoning districts. This actually isn't a new idea we came up with. This is actually an idea that staff is carrying forward from the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee, ZOAC, which issued their report approximately 10 years ago, I think, at this point. It is attached. The full report is attached for your reference to the staff report. Another use that was also recommended by ZOAC was to remove single family as a by right use in the T-zones. And then a third one, which isn't quite how ZOAC had worded it, but it is very similar in its intent, and that is to allow for expanded allowances for townhouse or multifamily housing by removing the 3-acre minimum for site development and the 2,600 square foot lot requirement for each of the townhouse lots themselves. As I noted up above in the request section, staff has brought forward two options. By right option, which would place these townhouse and multifamily housing units as a principal use permitted by right. Council could also select to reserve approval of those to be done by special use permit, which could be approvable by council. Let's see, number 4, adjustments to the building heights. And here, these adjustments were made largely in response to council feedback at prior work sessions. What's suggested in the draft code for you tonight is a maximum building height of either 4 stories or 50 feet, whichever is less. And paired with that would be a required step back on the top floor whenever it's adjacent to an R1A or R1B zoned property. And then the last one, which unfortunately just by formatting slid to the top of the next page, is adjusting the building lot coverage. So this is an increase in the amount of the lot that the building can occupy, although it's not an increase in the amount of impervious surface coverage. I think there's T-zone allows today a pretty large covering when it comes to surface parking lots. There was also there's also a series of suggested adjustments to the setback requirements, front yard, side yard, and rear yard, which would make it possible to get to that 80% lot coverage on a lot size of about a 1/4 acre to a 1/2 acre. And there is an increase in the rear yard setback requirement when adjacent to an R1A or R1B zone property. If we go to line, I'm sorry, my editing marks cover up my own line numbers. Line 31, just going through the history of this, as the manager already said, looking at the T-zones was a part of the council work plan. And really the impulse for this was back in February of 21 when council adopted the SE code, the special exception code changes. There was also direction provided that same night that staff developed tools to allow for infill development on smaller lots. And so staff has been working on that since then, and we've engaged council in that discussion in 3 work sessions. They're listed there on lines 39 and 40, June 21 of last year, November 22 of last year, and January 18 of this year. The remainder of these materials, I think, are all things you've seen before, so I'll just touch on them briefly. Line 42 provides a summary of what the T-zones are and where they are. There's a map online on the top of the next page showing where the T-zones are throughout the city. Next up is a chart summarizing what's allowable in T-zones today in terms of building height, setbacks, lot coverage limits. And then there are some example projects, whether they're projects in the city that were previously proposed by for development in the city, or example projects from around the region, and their summary statistics and their attached graphics and charts. And as I mentioned, these have all been in your packets before, so I don't want to walk through them again in the interest of time. I will leave my report there. And as I said, just to reiterate, staff is looking for feedback from council on this draft language. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. So before we take questions and comments, I'd just like to set the table just a bit. And it seems to me that this being the first time we've seen this language, at least in its current form, I know we've had conversations about it before, that this is something that we're at the beginning of this process, not at the end, or at least that's my understanding of where we are. I know members of the public have expressed their concern to many of us through correspondence in recent days. And so, again, my understanding of this process would be that there's going to be a time for further conversation, that this is the beginning of this conversation and having something to actually look at and discuss, but not the end of that conversation. So, and I'd suggest maybe we keep our comments at a fairly high level, given the hour, and we also have another item to do this evening as well. But let's go ahead and move on to comments and questions from council. Ms. Leon?
Yes, thank you for the work done on this. The one question that I had was eligible uses, and I noticed that rooming houses and boarding houses, which is a type of affordable housing, was struck out. Could you give me some background as to the rationale for the recommendation on removing that so that I can understand the full perspective and thinking that was brought forth there?
Sure. Yes. So some of this predates a little bit of my work with this, but if I had to guess, I would say that probably there was an intention to try and better focus, I guess, the housing options that would be available in the T-zone. That's my guess looking at sort of what's available here by opening up townhouses and condos and maybe removing some of those boarding houses and lodging houses, things of a more temporary nature.
Got it. So there's an understanding that's not factual, but implied that boarding house is more transitory, not for the folks who stay there, but in terms of structure. Just trying to understand.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think my guess is more about the connotation of the language and how it would be perceived.
Okay. I think we just want to make sure if there's an opportunity to perhaps think about combining that with the hotels section of that and really kind of taking that through for additional community feedback before we completely strike that out would be the suggestion there. And the clinics for human care, that the rationale for adding that, was that just staff recommendation, or like what was the background for adding that?
Yeah, it could just be a clarification. The previous line 8, allows for professional offices, including medical and dental. And so perhaps it might just be clarifying that would also be an allowable use.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Snyder.
He's on mute.
All right. Do we want to get to Mary Beth, and we'll let Dave figure out his... Mary Beth, why don't you go, and maybe Dave will hop in here.
Yeah. So I just want to, I feel like you just said we're at the very beginning of this. I feel like we're beyond the very beginning of this. This is like the third or fourth time we've seen this. So we have had a little bit of background, and every time we get to it, the hour is late and we're going to do a high level, and it seems like we're never going to get anywhere if we can't actually focus on it beyond the very beginning and the high level. So I was appreciative of the map that was in the materials. Can you pull that up, Mr. Stoddard?
Yeah, it's at the top of page, I'm sorry, it's line 54 of the staff report, top of page 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which highlights like 6 areas that we're talking about, which is not a ton. So my one question is, the people that we've heard from that are concerned seem to live on South Washington Street. The areas that they're concerned about have going concerns on them right now. So odds of those actually changing are pretty minimal. Is there any thought that we could, if there are concerns in some areas and not others, that we could do a partial transition to T-zones and come up with another designation? Or does it have to be all or nothing? That's my first question. And then my second question is, as we look at that big circle there on North Washington Street, how much of that is already filled with buildings that aren't going anywhere anytime soon? I mean, a lot of it is Sunrise. Well, that's there. It's not going to go anywhere. So the concerns that people have, I just wonder how, while I understand the concern, how actually valid the concern is that there's going to be a huge change right in their backyard.
Sure. So the short answer is, could it be different in different areas of the city or for different parcels? The short answer is yes. There are certainly a lot of ways to split that. It could be, you could establish a minimum or a maximum parcel size that could access these uses. You could establish it by geography of the city. Certainly today, the structure is 2 T-zones, and that would allow you some variation in how you set them. And of course, the approval process itself, whether it's by right or by special use permit reserved to the council, all those things would be options in divvying those things up. On the note about some of the larger acreage parcels already having buildings on them. Just a note that certainly these sites where there are sort of larger surface parking lots, especially where you've got, say, a house of worship, a church, there have been successful partnerships around the jurisdiction between houses of worship and affordable housing providers to reuse some of that underutilized land, those surface parking lots, for other uses. And so I think it's not necessarily something you would want to sort of, I don't know if you want to walk people into it, but it's an option you might want to leave open as part of any sort of system.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder?
Sure. Thanks. So a couple questions. First of all, it seems to me that each one of these T zones is fairly unique. And so it would seem to me that a special exception with the process with the approval of the council would make the most sense. Also, it seems that, Paul, what you've done is you've said, well, a huge amount of lot coverage can be impervious surface because they're permitted to have parking lots now. So it seems to me that we're defeating our environmental focus here by permitting that, allowing that as the standard for impervious surface and the absence of tree canopy and everything else that we say we need to address the stormwater issue and larger climate change issues. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on how much of these parcels can be covered by whatever the new structures are that would be permitted through the council process. Another issue is this is not a minor change, and I think any zoning change like this needs a very wide and citizen discussion and involvement, an extraordinary amount, not just simply the legal minimums here, to get people comfortable with the idea, to get it properly formed and shaped. But an example of one of the concerns I have is this huge preference for structures where we're actually going against our environmental objectives in order to do that. At least that's the way it was presented and discussed tonight. So those are a couple of the issues. Number one, the ability to tailor, to go through a kind of a special exception, whatever the right term for that is, very wide public discussion of this, and with particular efforts to engage the neighborhood so that people are comfortable. And third, I think we're permitting way too much construction in those zones that would be adverse to our environmental objectives. Thank you.
Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. Thank you for your work on this, Paul. I thought Mary Beth had a great point that we have been discussing this a lot. I also hear Dave Snyder's concerns that, anytime we do zoning changes, of course, we want to take them seriously. But this is like the third or fourth time we've discussed it. And so I'm glad to see the language on paper so that we can actually get down to specifics. To that end, I have a couple of questions and suggestions. Paul, you mentioned that the impervious coverage allowed today because parking lots are by right in T-zones is pretty high. Do we know what that number is and how does that compare to the 80% maximum building coverage?
Yeah, so I have a footnote there from a previous staff report that I copy and pasted, and that is on, the chart begins on line 65. The footnote is actually on the page below it where it notes that there is no maximum impervious coverage limit.
So theoretically, someone could take a T-zone right now and put asphalt parking lot in the entire thing?
Yeah, I'd have to double check whether the parking lot would have to be ancillary to a building on the site, but that is how I read it. Now, any change to a site is going to have to conform to the modern stormwater standard. So whether you're putting a building on it or a parking lot on it, and any change in the site that goes over the disturbance limit would have to meet site plan requirements for stormwater.
Got it. So again, based on kind of the concept of T-zones, is kind of meant to be the in-between, like the Goldilocks of, not as dense and tall as your commercial areas and clearly not like your residential. A lot of what's proposed in the draft language made sense to me. I think, for example, in special exceptions right now, I think the most recent project that we approved, Founders Row 2, had, I think, 15% open space. So in other words, 85% lot coverage. Is that how I'm interpreting it? That's kind of what we accomplished there.
Yeah, I'd have to double check to make sure that they were counting ground level open space on that number. That number sounds right to me. I just need to check that it's, you know, what it's attached to.
Got it. So 80%, for example, proposed in T-zones doesn't feel unreasonable to me, especially because it is 4 stories with some tapering. That said, so that's kind of my first thing is just, again, having that Goldilocks comparison, right? What's allowed right now when we do special exceptions in those commercial areas, what's allowed in residential, and then finding that kind of right balance in between. I think the second kind of big concept to think about is what sort of quote unquote voluntary concessions, things that we care about. So I know that under the option to have some more council purview, things like affordable housing is called out. I think stormwater is called out. I think for me, those two are really important when we talk about touching T-zones. So the values that we have about residential redevelopment and commercial development, I'd like to see some standards around affordable housing and stormwater. I don't know whether that means the process therefore has to go through this conditional use permit process or whether we can just spell it out in the zoning text. What is staff's opinion on that?
So some of that is a legal question that we would want to work with the city attorney on. There are allowances. Is Carol on? Great, Carol. Maybe I'll just bounce the question right over to you immediately.
Well, I think that, obviously always the devil's in the details, but for a very simple standard that applies the same way to each property, you can write it into the zoning ordinance.
But Carol,
in general, but affordable housing will be somewhat, we'll have to really sort of watch that. I mean, we have to look at the whole picture, but there are ways to try to write some of the standards into the ordinance itself.
I mean, Carol, if I could just interject here. I mean, to my mind, if you don't have a by right option except for providing affordable housing, I don't think you get yourself in legally or allowed to do that. I think that's very problematic.
I think that's correct. You would have to have something that is allowed. You do have to have a reasonable by right option that wouldn't require those things. To ask somebody to do affordable housing, you'd have to have an increase in what they got, clearly.
But I mean, I think even, I think personally, and I'll tell you what, I'll let others go, but I think that there's a lot of pitfalls here unless we do this carefully and thoughtfully. And so I think this is one in particular that we need to make sure, if the goal is to, for example, get affordable housing and other things, that we need to make sure we're not clever by half. And I think we would need to have some consideration. I'll reserve my own time for a little bit later on, but I just wanted to interject with that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we do have to look at the whole thing, how it all shapes out in the end, but there are some ways to go about that.
Okay. I guess what I'm favoring is perhaps like a hybrid option between what we think of as a full-fledged special exception and a by right option. And maybe that's what's contemplated by this special use permit. Could someone describe to me what the special use permit process looks like?
Carol, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
I don't get involved with it that much, but honestly, the special use permit that we have right now is items that go before the Board of Zoning Appeals generally, and the BZA grants use permits for some uses that are called out specifically in the ordinance. So it's technically, legally the same thing as a special exception, but there's a different procedure and format that we use for it, and they get approved in general now by the by our Board of Zoning Appeals, which is not to say that some use permits cannot be approved by council. I mean, I think that's done for many things in Arlington, but that's going to require a big process to set up how that would work.
Got it. So let me tell you what my intent is, and then I'll let staff figure out the right process to use. So I would like either some standards for affordable housing and kind of stormwater to take care of them on T-zones. If that means that council needs to have more oversight into it, or if that means it can be written into the language of the zoning text, I am agnostic. I think I'd be okay with some sort of, again, hybrid option where it is not as intense as a special exception as today, but not a by right one because of those things. I think those important priorities, I think that we share across council to not get done. And then my third or fourth point is to Dave Snyder's concern of making sure that everyone in the community is well aware. Again, I feel like we've talked plenty about this, but given that we are finally at the language stage, and I've counted, there's only 7 areas across the city that have T-zones. When we are ready to actually take votes or do another work session on this, perhaps we just put up those yellow yard signs that we put up normally when there's hearings, and that really just ensures that people in that community know that we're talking about the T-zones that are adjacent to them, and we get good community engagement that way. Because I do think it is a pretty limited part of, out of all the land that we have in the city, it's pretty limited. So that's a really easy way to get in touch with them. But thank you for the work on this. I am mostly very comfortable with what's proposed so far and ready to see it move to the next steps. Thank you.
Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. First to staff. We have been asking for quite some time from the Economic Development Committee to try to get this into the dock, and I know there's been obviously a lot more going on, and so I appreciate the extra effort to bring this before us. My comments are too, I think, generally aligned with what Ms. Hardy had to say. Other good questions have been put forward. I guess my question is, earlier tonight there was a referral, or there was a mention of code required referrals to the EDA, the PC, Planning Commission, Urban Forestry, and Architectural Advisory Board. That's a sort of streamlined referral process, and I'm just wondering if I like the idea of preserving council's role in the approval of buildings in a modified T-zone ordinance. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the economies of scale of these smaller projects, don't warrant, the extremely lengthy and extremely involved process that we've used for the much bigger developments. And so I'm wondering if staff can give some guidance about what a streamlined required referral process would look like with EDA, PC, Urban Forestry, and Architectural Advisory Board. Is that something that describe for me how that has worked and how it might work in a new T-zone regimen?
Sure. So there's depending on the application type, the code lays out which groups have mandatory reviews. Whenever council refers something out, of course, it has the option to send it out more broadly, and that's typically what happens with special exception applications. There's no requirement in the SE code that council send those out to all groups. There are some mandated groups that review different applications, whether it's a land use map change or a rezoning change. And so, but I think staff could bring some ideas to you. And of course, even after the zoning entitlements were in place, if council were to hold a special use permit or some sort of hybrid approval, it would still need to proceed to a site plan application, and site plan applications are approved by the Planning Commission, and those do have mandatory reviews by Architectural Advisory Board and Urban Forestry. So built into the process, it's already going to go to those 3 groups.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good to know. All right. Well, just stepping back. Thank you. That's a good answer. Stepping back, why are we talking about doing this? To me, the answer to that question is because we have some number, not that many, but we have some number of plots in the city in transitional areas that are economically, architecturally, environmentally, in every way underperforming. And for whatever reason, during the 10-year span of time when we have been very successful in attracting development proposals to larger tracts, we have not been able to get anything up out of the ground in these T-zone locations. So what can we do to try to alleviate that? My question in that line goes to, my interest primarily is in trying to encourage the market to bring us condominium developments where units might sell for as little as $700,000 or $800,000. Basically, they would be starter condos in the Falls Church market. Some will go to much higher price tags than that, I understand. But I'm trying to find space for, 2 government workers, 2 teachers, 2 firefighters, 2 cops, a family to put their incomes together and get, their hand on the ladder of the Falls Church owned real estate market. And this is the only way that I can see that we have a shot at doing this. Of all the great things that we've done, we've only built railroad cottages in that middle income price point, less than $1 million. Hard to believe that's middle income, but that's the way it is. And so I'm interested in hearing any ideas about any way that we can convert these underused T-zone spaces, which are not really any kind of good commercial space. They're generally off the beaten track or not in areas that have, targeted by our small area plans as commercial areas of promise. I'd like to see them used for residential purposes and preferably for condominium. Is there any way that we can, if not ensure, at least weight proposals that we might receive towards condominiums as opposed to rental? I think we've done, pretty good bit of rental. And so I don't know that I need to encourage much more of that. But is there anything that we can do in the wording of the ordinance to encourage proposals from the build to sell developer?
That's really can't be done. I mean, there's a flat out prohibition on treating properties any differently because of the form of ownership between as rental to condo.
All right, what about I understand the legalities of it, but what about the economics of it? I mean, if we're not seeing, 20, 30, 40 unit condominium buildings on 4-acre parcels, the reasons seem obvious. If we have smaller parcels, do other jurisdictions in our area see that those smaller parcels through their local zoning processes are able to attract the kind of product that I'm interested in attracting? That's really a planning question, not so much a legal question, I guess.
That's definitely something we could research. Put in some calls to other planning offices nearby and ask what they're seeing in terms of building tenure for these smaller lots.
Okay, all right. I think that would be helpful just to try to, illustrate to the community why we're doing this, why we're talking about. At least from my perspective, that's one of the main drivers for needing to do this, because I don't have any other bright ideas for how to bring a housing product into the city for purchase, except the Amazon grant money, which is great and is going to help, a small number of folks, but at least it's going to help somebody get into the buying loop. But except for that, I assume that the condominiums up at Westfalls are going to be, very premium, high-end luxury, starting at $1.5 million, which is fine. I mean, that's a product we need too. But it's not quite what I'm looking for. So yeah, I think it would be helpful to see what other jurisdictions are able to attract in terms of that sort of condominium product, and just to make sure that whatever language we adopt, whatever process we adopt, encourages that, incentivizes that. I realize we can't require it, Madam Attorney, but I do want to incentivize it. Thank you.
Ms. Hiscott?
Thanks. I really just want to pick up a couple of threads along these last few conversations, and Phil kind of went to where I was going to. What was the reason that we wanted to do this, and kind of trying to keep that at the forefront. I like Letty's construct and staff's as well about some type of hybrid. Obviously, we haven't been getting the offers to do this because of the process involved in doing so, and Phil, your comment about economies of scale. I agree with all of that. I also just wanted to throw out there in terms of environmental, the ESC has been having a number of conversations about decreasing parking and increasing density, the more population you have closer to our transportation hubs, walkable to East Falls Church Metro, West Falls Church Metro, et cetera, is really longer term beneficial. If the people who work here can live here, those 2 cops, those 2 teachers, whomever you meant, like it actually has a positive environmental impact if we're keeping our eye on stormwater and tree coverage, you know, to the extent we can as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there and echo a lot of the comments from Mary Beth, well, from everybody basically. Obviously, we need to do this thoughtfully, but I do feel like we've talked about it for over a year, and you know, eager to move forward to try to get some traction on bringing some of these types of products, housing products in the city. Thanks.
All right, Miss Connolly.
I just had a quick, as far as advertising to the affected neighbors, I like Letty's suggestion of putting up signs. I think we could also do the same thing to do with neighborhood traffic calming, which is to reach out to all the affected neighbors. There really aren't that many of them, to notify them that this is happening. I think that is important, and it really shouldn't be that difficult because it's such a small number of adjacent properties. That's all I have.
Ms. Leon?
Yeah, so I just, I think I've got 4 points. So I just want to make sure that, you know, for the record, that the value of transition areas, right, is really important, right, from just a larger national scale, right? These transition areas and how we define it help address land utilization, right? It helps address housing supply, right? As our city grows, we need diverse housing choices to serve more people in a wider range of income brackets. We are not good at that here in the city. We are not progressive in it at all. There are other areas, San Bernardino, Portland, Austin, New Hampshire. I would ask that we not call our neighbors, but we go to progressive states and localities that deal with 2.2 square miles of their downtown areas and are doing this. So, Paul, I'm happy to make some introductions for you. We're, you know, transition areas are also important because they're also strategically located within, you know, normally approximately like 5-minute walking distance to commercial goods and services. It's great for the city, right? Because we're so small, it supports that. I want us to make sure that we're thinking of, you know, we're kind to ourselves in perhaps considering, you know, pilots of this stuff. A lot of cities, when they take this on, do not go big bang, right? They take and acknowledge there's certain areas, right? And they pick one pocket and they pilot some of the, you know, the T-zone changes in that one area, right? And when it comes to by right or special exception, I think what we want to, you know, think about in terms of a business proposition, right, for both the city in terms of attracting residents and folks that want to develop here, is that we want to manage the ability to support by right, you know, when it's 1 or 2, when it's minimum of 2, but when it's larger, like 10 or 11, we think through, you know, more of a review process. So it's a bifurcated flow that safeguards what it is that we want to put here in the city, but it adds efficiency for both the city as well as the attractiveness for the developers who want to develop these small plots. So I think this is great. I think it's a great conversation. I've been tracking it before I even started at council when you guys were talking about this in 21. And I think that it's really worth a conversation to keep continuing to push forward.
All right, thank you. Mr. Snyder? Dave?
You're muted, Dave.
Sure. I liked Councilmember Leon's idea of a pilot before we jump into this, or we make these. We're very, very careful about the context of each of these. I will make this comment that if the so-called missing middle, that is affordable condos, are an objective, we have, as I mentioned in Founders Row 2, and I'll mention again, that we can get lots of of more affordable condos in these large so-called mixed-use projects if we just negotiate for that. So there is an answer that's far immediate and far more available to us, and we have another major project that's out there now with hundreds of apartment units. Let's just incentivize it so that a lot of those are condo units, so we really don't need to engage in this this work in this way on the T-zones. Thank you.
All right, I've got a few comments. One about the notion that this is clearly we've been talking about it for a year, but this is the first time we've actually had language for us to consider, and more importantly, for neighboring property owners and others to consider. And so I do think it deserves contemplation, and I wouldn't say that, quote, this language has been under consideration for a year. It hasn't. It's been under consideration for half an hour, formally as part of this first hearing. So I do think it requires and should have additional public comment and conversation that we've discussed. And I think it is appropriate to involve the community as a whole and our neighbors, particularly neighbors as well. A couple of thoughts. I mean, one thing, we've got a pretty good process, or at least I think so, with respect to large development. And why is it good? Well, the city and I think the neighborhood and the community gets a lot of things out of new development. And it's not just new housing, but it's also capital contributions for the school, for libraries, stormwater improvements, traffic improvements, retail, ground level retail, and other uses that bring in tax dollars. There's a whole suite of things that come with our current process. And what I think we ought not to do is undercut that process, that successful process, by finding an alternative, less expensive way for people to develop multifamily residential. And there may be certain categories where you've got a small infill site that's just a couple units that I agree doesn't deserve the same level of scrutiny and development. But there are other sites, and that big circle on Washington Street is one of those areas where even though there's something there now, there won't be something there forever. And even Sunrise, is probably, I don't know whether it's stick built or not, but irrespective of it, one of these days coming up, even church parking lots and churches themselves redevelop. And I guess the question is, do they redevelop without any council supervision and involvement to try to mitigate issues, including impacts on neighbors, on the environment, and also achieve community benefits for the broader community? And to my mind, the answer is no. We need to make sure, certainly, that large-scale development, redevelopment, T1 zones retains city council ultimate say. Where the break point is, I don't know. But I do think that large-scale redevelopment should not try to seek a lesser expensive and easier and quicker way to redevelop, thereby short-skirting affordable housing contributions and other expectations that have developed over years and years of through this process. And I think what's also important is just even ground floor retail. We haven't talked about that. Certainly affordable housing's important, but I think also having ground floor retail is important to our tax base. And again, in these large scale redevelopment, I'm not sure there's a mechanism to get that. So I would vote for continuing to have city council approval and discretion, certainly on maybe mid to large projects. Maybe there are smaller ones that don't require that, but I think that's a conversation we need to have. I also think it's a mistake to remove single family by right option. First off, just even legally, I mean, you have to have a reasonable by right option, or otherwise it's a confiscation, it's a taking. And so we want to be very careful about that. And so to my mind, taking away the by right, single family by right option introduces that issue. Anyway, I just have some concerns with this. I do real estate for a living, zoning, land use. And so I know how folks will try to, use this to their advantage, which is understandable because that's developers' jobs. But I think we need to make sure that we don't fall down a path that eliminates some of the benefits and protections that we've developed over many years for both our citizens and our community and our schools overall. through community benefits that we achieve in these large scale projects. So again, I think we need to have further conversation in my mind to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences. We have something now finally to look at, which we've not had for the past year or so. But I do think we need to really parse this out and make sure particularly Carol has involvement to ensure that we continue to get the things that are important to this community in all projects going forward. Letty, you had a comment? Additional comment?
So based on your idea about kind of the larger scale parcels, maybe staff can give some thought to, maybe it's like 2.5 acres and above would require kind of more of a special exception like process. And then the ones that are smaller, where there's just not the economies of scale for us it's not worth it for us to spend that much time. Maybe staff can give some thought onto whether something like that might make sense. And then second, on ground floor retail, I know that there's probably differing schools of thought on where we think retail should belong based on kind of Founders Road 2 discussion. But I guess personally, I just don't want to force retail where it doesn't belong, especially where in the changing environment with retail, obviously just even pre-COVID, the world is pretty different. I think we've seen obviously from the growth of our commercial tax base that even multifamily residential contributes towards that commercial. So I'm personally in the place where I don't feel like I need to force ground floor retail, and the priorities for me are really around affordable housing and stormwater and the environmental things.
Got it. Yeah, I guess I would have a more broad view of what we need, and I would also just suggest over time apartments that yield the the fiscal impact. I think on a 30-year-old or 40-year-old or 50-year-old apartment is much different than a brand new apartment building, and our experience most recently has been entirely in the brand new structures. So I think there's things to consider. Obviously, we all don't agree on what those things are. I would also suggest a smaller size, 2.5 units, 2.5 acres could be 100 or more, depending on the scale of units. And I, for one, would like to continue to see community benefits on projects that are smaller than that. What the exact break is, I don't know, but I do think it's important that we don't lose what we have already. Any final words or comments from anyone? Bill?
Just a question, if I could. So, Mr. Snyder mentioned the notion of a pilot. I'm hearing you all kick around, the size and so forth. I'm just wondering, can an ordinance of this nature be enacted with, some sort of a timestamp on it that tells the market, okay, look, there's a new set of rules in town for these smaller parcels, whatever we decide smaller parcels are. What do you got for us? And we give 2 or 3 years for that to work its way through, and then it's got a sunset provision in it, and we basically step back and say, okay, well, how'd that work? I mean, is that something that is A, legal, and B, feasible? Or does it have any precedent in anything we've done before?
It's legal. I will say it's often difficult because it's difficult to predict how long it will take for projects to come in. And it is possible later to simply re-amend the zoning in a different way. But I mean, legally, there's a way to have a sunset clause in an ordinance.
Okay, well, I'm just bringing that up.
We did this with cottages, didn't we, Carol, where we said we're going to limit X number of projects within the first couple of years?
I think we put a limit on the number of projects annually, I think, actually, in that.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's what I'm recalling. I'm looking for some sort of vehicle like that. I mean, hey, we'd all be able to predict the future, wouldn't we? We'd love to know if Tartar's right or I'm right about how many children are going to be coming out of, Founders Road 2 in 2050. I mean, who knows? I can't legislate around that. I just have to hope that based on the 40 some years that I've lived here, we've done pretty well for ourselves, and 40 years from now, we'll still be doing pretty well if smart, dedicated people keep running the ship of state. But, I understand that there's certain short-term anxieties that maybe we could address if we assure people that, look, if this thing turns out to be a mess, it's got a sunset provision in it, and, we're going to take another look at it. That is an out that would appeal to me as one way to try to build some consensus around. We need to do something. We just need to do something, because otherwise we're going to be stuck with, underperforming brick Cape Cod houses on Park Avenue until the 23rd century. We just can't have that.
So I might suggest, in addition to Paul taking account of what you've just heard, Carol, if you can have maybe more involvement than you've traditionally maybe had in some of these things in the past, to ensure that some of the conversations we've had and some of the suggestions that have been made, you could just truth test them. Are they actually in fact legal? Or are there issues with attempting to do a pilot program or limit something to, one a year? Can you actually do that? Or whatever it is that you've heard tonight, if you could spend some time trying to ensure that whatever steps we take are appropriate and legal and don't set us up for any, negative recourse as a community or as a city, but try to help guide us, at least to make sure that we, follow things. But there are questions and conversations about, how do we wade into this without jumping in? And I guess I'd like some guidance from you as to, how that would work. And it may be something you probably don't have a lot of experience with. I certainly don't. And maybe you don't either, but you could research it.
Yeah, I think, I haven't been involved much in this one, partly because there's been a lot of other things going on that have been taking my time, but I will try to get more involved and work more directly on trying to shape, an ordinance around what we're trying to accomplish. So I think that's where we really need to focus on.
Jim Snyder?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, this is a very interesting conversation. As you can imagine, Paul and I and the manager have had a lot of discussion about this. There could be a way, I think, to focus on smaller sites. Many of the sites on Park Avenue, for example, are not large sites. Their acreage is small. And the condominium market, we believe, is tending to focus on a smaller number of units rather than a larger number of units, because that is the market that they're going after. Another possibility would be to look at sites which are currently planned for mixed use, where there's an expectation that they might be eligible to be zoned up to a B zone, where larger and more dense projects would result and more consolidation would take place. So one of the possibilities of having smaller sites or focusing on smaller sites that have mixed use designations would be that you'd limit the places these things could go, and you might have developments that would have less height and density and would be achieved with a larger, longer scale consolidation and upzoning to the business side. So those are some of the things that we've talked about, but I pass those on to you for your consideration.
Okay, well, great. Look, this has been a lot of good things. You all have obviously had some good internal conversations. I think collectively, Council is also having a good conversation here. Might I suggest that, Jim, Paul, Carol, and Wyatt, if you want to join in the fun, get together after this meeting, the coming days, and try to synthesize what you've heard and respond in ways that are thoughtful, that, are legally appropriate and, maybe have precedent if that's possible, either here or elsewhere, and come back to us with, how you might change this or address the concerns that have been raised tonight. And in the meantime, also make sure the community, particularly affected community, is aware of this conversation. Does that sound like a plan? Okay. Unless there's anything else on this, why don't we move on to the next item? The MOA, I believe it's called.
That's right. So we have two items together. One is the conveyance of the property, which is done by ordinance, and we also have a memorandum of agreement. And let me turn it over to our city attorney, Carol McCoskey, who can give the council an update on this. And the kind of the new document is the MOA, and we can summarize that briefly as well. Ms. McCoskey.
Yes, Counsel. And the main reason I wanted to bring this before you tonight was just so that you all would have an opportunity to receive the MOA in your packet and get an opportunity to review it. It's fairly simple. It directs that the EDA will own the property and lease it out in accordance with the comprehensive agreement, and it restricts some things that the EDA, cannot put liens on the property or do any other transactions with relation to it without city consent. It also it just has some fairly general provisions about the parties working together and some general protective matters about how we're not partners or joint venturers. And the other thing that we have done, which is in the other report, is I wanted you to also to have a copy of the deed as it's written now. The deed would refer to the memorandum of agreement and that deed, so that, and the EDA will sign off on accepting the deed as giving them the property to use in accordance with the MOA. So I don't want to go into too much detail unless you request it. I think with regard to the memorandum of agreement, it's not long. It's pretty simple. I even note, I think there may be a couple of paragraphs that are a little bit repetitive, but there aren't that many paragraphs to read. And I think it's one you can read and understand. And I just want to make sure that you all had a chance to get a copy of it and see it before it comes before you next week for action. I will be, I remain available to go over some of these documents in detail for anyone on council. If you like, feel free to call me with any questions. I'm happy to talk about it because there will be a lot coming at you, and it's complicated. But let me also remind you that this is nothing new. This is simply implementing what we decided to do when we approved the various parts of the comprehensive agreement, and it does not create greater liability or responsibility for City Council than has already been committed to. A number of the documents for the leasing of the property will obviously be carried out by the EDA once the property is conveyed to them. So I'm also going to go briefly through, and then I can open up for any questions on any of them. Item F, 1F, which is the resolution to authorize the city manager to basically execute the other documents that the city still will undertake as part of the comprehensive agreement. It's in addition to leases, most leases and the declaration. It's not the major documents. Those will get turned over to the EDA when they own the property. But I just wanted to make sure that we got the authorization in there and before you. I also want to note, and this is important, the second paragraph of that resolution is, so that's down line 90, Cindy, is in there because currently the developer's arrangements with the hotel are that the developer, FCGP, and one of their entities will be building the building, and then will, as soon as the building is ready, turn it over to, I believe it's Hilton. We have to get the exact name put in here so that it's clear who they can turn it over to. But under the comprehensive agreement, if before the whole project is stabilized, the developer seeks to transfer ownership of any of the property, they have to get city consent. And the purpose here is we have 15 days to do that consent. And the purpose here is to make it so that for this one item, which we know will come up now, pre-stabilization, to transfer the hotel building from FCGP to the Hilton entity, we want to make sure that the city manager will be authorized to do that approval. And he can be in touch with you at the time and let you all know. But if that is what the purpose of paragraph 2 is, to ensure that it's clear that the city consent for that paragraph can be given in this case by the city manager. But we will have the final language with a better reference to the Hilton entity to whom they are planning to convey that property. So I just wanted to make sure that you all had seen all these items before they come to you next week. I'm happy to try to answer any questions on them with regard to the conveyance and the memorandum of agreement, if that is also any of these matters, I'm happy to take questions on.
Well, you got one of them, Ms. Conley.
Mary Beth.
On line 9495 there, where you talk about the transfer to Hilton.
Right.
Is first class hotel a term of art? Are there certain hotels that would be first class and others that would not be?
Yes, and I will need to verify that language. I had put that in there as a placeholder for now, but I will work with our outside attorney and we will clarify both the name of the hotel product that they are seeking to transfer it to, and I will take a look at that language and make sure that it is in there and is meaningful before it gets finally approved by council next week.
Thanks.
Sure.
Other questions, comments?
If I could just make a couple of comments. So one, the Hilton product, which the city is informed is to be a home to product from Hilton. And that was discussed as part of the site plan, maybe not in a lot of depth, but that is the flag that is intended for the project. And I think they did have graphics of kind of what the finishes are and what that product typically looks like. Back before COVID, Jim Snyder, Carly, and I went to Hilton headquarters. We were invited to have a presentation on this product, and so that is the intent. And also, this transfer, the transfer would not be to Hilton Corporation. It would be to an operator that is well established, that runs many Hilton product hotels as the operator. And we are doing the due diligence on that right now with outside legal counsel and with Ted Risher, just to make sure that this operator is successful in operating these hotel, operating with Hilton. So I wanted to provide that additional bit of information.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? So I've got one or two. One, I might add in the MOA that there's no third-party beneficiaries intended. I didn't see that there, but I think probably would be good to have that in. I had mentioned before about putting in the deed itself that there's a separate agreement.
Yes, and it's in there now.
Oh, it's in the whereas clause or the witness. Okay, got it. That's good.
Yeah.
And let's see what else we've got here. Does our comprehensive agreement provide for notice both to the EDA and the city in terms of if there's any default or breach or notice required? Who are the notice parties in there? Because you'd want to make sure it's both of them, not just one or the other, since they're going to be the title owner. Yeah, we're really the party in interest.
I believe it is in there, but it also will be in all the leases.
Okay, just make sure that both
right.
parties, the EDA and us, are both in there
Both
for
notice
notice.
parties.
Yeah. I think that's probably all that I have. Does anyone else have anything else? Okay. How about other comments or questions? Does anybody have anything else they want to say before we adjourn for the evening? I don't know if there's any more basketball to be had. Debbie, have you been keeping up with the game?
Oh yeah.
How's it going?
It's a strong halftime showing for the good guys.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we'll leave that a mystery who the good guys are, but I think we have an idea who we're talking about. But anyway, listen, unless there's anything else, why don't we call it a night? And everyone have a great evening, and we'll be reconvening for our meeting on Wednesday. So thanks, everyone, and we'll talk soon. Good evening.
Thanks, Counsel.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night, all.